Hello, crime enthusiasts. Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Andrea Lohagen. Andrea Lohagen was born on January 6, 1977, in Bad Belzig, Germany, to a tight-knit family that consisted of her mother, father, and sister. They lived in a newly built residential complex. As children, Andrea and her sister were known for being obedient and diligent in their studies, which made their parents incredibly proud. By the time Andrea turned 16, she had developed into a stunning young woman and an outstanding student, earning her numerous admirers. Andrea and her sister focused primarily on their studies and socializing with friends at parties, avoiding any unwholesome or troubling pursuits. On October 7, 1993, during the autumn break, 16 years old, Andrea spent the day at a local shopping center with her parents. With only 1 year of high school remaining, Andrea was on the cusp of a significant milestone, looking forward to completing her exams and embarking on her journey into adulthood. Andrea harbored dreams of attending university, building a career, and eventually starting a family of her own. The thought of entering this new phase of her life filled her with immense excitement and anticipation. During their outing to the shopping center, Andrea bought new shoes and jeans. She excited to wear them to a party at the club that was coming up soon. That evening, Andrea, a high school student, planned to attend a gathering at the local youth center, where her friends and acquaintances were waiting for her. The center was only a 15-minute walk from Andrea's home in the small town of Bad Belzig. Since the town was considered very safe, with no prior incidents of attacks or crimes, Andrea's parents felt comfortable allowing her to walk to the party alone. Andrea was expected to return home by 10 p.m. to watch a horror movie with her mother, as was their evening routine. However, when Andrea did not come home on time, her family assumed she would be home in a few hours. Andrea's friends who were at the party said she never showed up, which caused them to become worried. This was unusual behavior for Andrea, who was known for being responsible and punctual. She had never been late before, so her friends were worried. Unfortunately, it was difficult to reach Andrea directly, as mobile phones were not widely used at the time, and the youth center didn't have a landline phone. Her friends would have had to leave the party to call her from another location. Nevertheless, the group chose not to jump to conclusions and stayed at the club. They thought Andrea might be dealing with family issues that prevented her from attending the party. Despite the youth center being close by, none of them tried to check on her. The girls assumed Andrea was either running late or grounded at home, and they continued to enjoy the party. However, when Andrea failed to return home by midnight, her mother grew worried. Normally, Andrea would be home by this time, watching another horror movie. At first, Andrea's mother thought she came home late because she had gone out with friends or visited someone's house. But as the hours passed and Andrea didn't show up, her mother became increasingly alarmed. She tried to contact her daughter's friends, with whom Andrea was supposed to be visiting that evening, but none of them were home. This left her unable to get any information about Andrea's whereabouts. Later, one of the girls finally answered, but she had no information about Andrea. The mother became increasingly worried, realizing that her daughter could not stay out so late, as she had to go to school the next day. At 1 a.m., the mother's concern reached a breaking point. She woke up her husband, and they set out in their car at 1:30 a.m. to search for Andrea. They spent hours searching the area around Bad Belzig but found nothing. They visited the youth center, but Andrea wasn't there. Andrea's friends were unable to provide a clear explanation for her disappearance. It was also unknown whether she went missing while heading to the club or after leaving it. Most partygoers had already left, and the remaining youths couldn't provide much information. Around 4 a.m., Andrea's frantic parents reported her disappearance to the local police. However, the police responded slowly and failed to conduct a timely search for Andrea. The police officers initially thought that Andrea had just gone out and would come back home by herself in the morning, once she was sober. However, her parents were certain that something terrible had happened to her. They knew Andrea wouldn't run away because she had no reason to do so. All Andrea's belongings and money were still at home, she wasn't dating anyone, and none of her friends had seen her that night. A week went by before the police started investigating Andrea's disappearance. Up until then, her parents had been searching the town on their own. They had contacted all the local hospitals, but none of them had any information about Andrea. As the search continued without any success, Andrea's parents become increasingly suspicious of a plot of land formerly owned by Andrea's ex-boyfriend's grandfather. Andrea and her ex-boyfriend had broken up shortly before she went missing. There were reports that her ex-boyfriend was struggling to cope with their breakup. The outside of the property appeared abandoned, except for a small, old shed that caught the attention of Andrea's parents. They suspected that Andrea's ex-boyfriend might be connected to her disappearance. They thought it was possible that he had ambushed her on her way to the club, attacked her, and taken her. The parents immediately contacted Andrea's ex-boyfriend, but he denied any involvement. He stated that he was at home for the entire evening and night, and his family members were ready to confirm his alibi. However, Andrea's family didn't believe him. The police were informed by Andrea's parents about a suspicious piece of land owned by her ex-boyfriend's grandfather, and they agreed to investigate. It wasn't until a week after Andrea's disappearance that the police took the investigation seriously. Detectives started questioning the people who were at the youth club on the night Andrea went missing. Many of the partygoers were friends and acquaintances of Andrea, but their statements didn't shed any light on the case. The teenagers who frequented the club often got their dates and days mixed up, making their accounts confusing and unclear. Some people claimed to have seen Andrea at the party, but others disagreed. Initially, investigators thought Andrea might have arrived at the party, then gotten lost in the crowd or left with someone she knew, or possibly been attacked. This theory seemed believable, given that parties with teenagers often involve alcohol, which can lead to incidents when people are leaving. However, after talking to more witnesses, it became clear that Andrea never actually made it to the party, which was confirmed by her friends who were waiting for her. Andrea, who was known for her beauty at school, didn't show up to meet her friends. Detectives believed the accounts from Andrea's closest friends were the most trustworthy. Police have thoroughly checked all routes Andrea might have taken to get to the club. They launched a large-scale search operation involving trained dogs and many volunteers. Despite their extensive efforts, they couldn't find any signs of Andrea. Numerous press conferences and TV reports were held to ask citizens for help in finding Andrea and warning them of potential danger. Andrea's parents and law enforcement worked together to investigate her disappearance. They made appeals for negotiation in case she was abducted, set up hotlines for witness tips, and offered monetary rewards. However, all efforts were unsuccessful due to a lack of evidence or leads. Many tips were verified, but they turned out to be false. The detectives were only able to piece together a rough timeline of incident leading up to Andrea's disappearance. On the evening of Thursday, October 7, 1993, Andrea returned home from a shopping center with her parents around 6 p.m. She went to her room, listened to music, and looked at her new clothes. The family had dinner together, and Andrea planned to attend a party at the youth club afterwards. She tried to contact a friend to go together, but her friend was already at the club and couldn't be reached. Andrea decided to go alone, and her parents didn't know what she did next. Investigators suspected that Andrea may have been a victim of sexual assault. They thought that her attractive appearance might have caught the attention of a predator, leading to a crime. To investigate, detectives made a list of Andrea's ex-boyfriends and admirers and checked their alibis. Investigation found that each of the suspects had a reliable alibi for the time of the incident, making it unlikely they were involved. Unfortunately, the surveillance system at the time was relatively underdeveloped, making the investigation more difficult. Detectives started looking for witnesses who might have seen what happened to Andrea. They found out that she had taken a shortcut to the club that evening, and several people had seen her along the way. According to their accounts, Andrea had passed by a group of young people and a couple of teenagers. But she didn't know any of them, so she just kept walking. The last people to see Andrea alive were two boys, 13 years old Robin and 14 years old David. By law, their identities and photos were kept private, but detectives were able to track them down and take their statements. The boys said they had simply nodded at Andrea and then gone their separate ways. After that, Andrea seemed to disappear. It became clear that Andrea never made it to the meeting spot with her friends, which meant something terrible must have happened to her on the way. The path she took was a little-known shortcut that mostly only local residents were familiar with. So, the search for suspects focused on people who lived in the nearby houses. Immediately, the police investigation focused on Robin and David, the two teenagers who were the last to see Andrea alive. Both boys came from difficult home environments and lived close to the Andrea family's residence. They were familiar with the path Andrea had taken. Although they were young, Robin and David had a history of minor crimes, including thefts and break-ins. However, there was not enough evidence to accuse them of a serious crime like assault and abduction. Due to Robin and David's young age, the suspicions against them were eventually dropped. The case stalled, and for the next 7 years, there were no new developments. Then, on July 7, 2000, a local resident stumbled upon a horrifying discovery while out for a walk. His dog found a human skull and brought it to him, laying it on the ground. At first, the man thought the skull was a ball, but after he realized it was actually a human skull that had been stripped of its flesh. The skull had a hole in the occipital bone. At first, the resident thought the dog had discovered old remains from World War II, as burials from that time were commonly found in the area. To be safe, the resident informed the police. When detectives received the news, they quickly went to the scene with search dogs. The location where the skull was found belonged to Andrea's former boyfriend. After a lengthy and thorough search, a complete human skeleton was found behind the door of a partially collapsed shed, hidden under a pile of construction debris. The skeleton's poor condition made initial identification impossible. Searching the nearby utility building did not turn up any clues, personal items, pieces of clothing, or other evidence. In recent years, the only person to have gone missing without a trace in the area was Andrea Lohagen. Consequently, most people immediately assumed the remains belonged to her. Andrea's parents described the outfit she wore on the day of her disappearance, including new black platform shoes and jeans purchased that day. However, none of these clothing items were discovered in the shed, which implies that the perpetrators likely got rid of them. It was also possible that Andrea's clothes were torn off shortly before her death, perhaps during an attempted assault. The remains were only identified as Andrea's after a thorough forensic examination, including an analysis of dental records. This allowed Andrea's family to learn the truth about her fate and give her a proper burial. However, it also sparked concerns about how thorough the initial searches were, since her body was found in an area that had already been searched before. A review of the search operation reports showed that investigators had examined the area, including an abandoned shed filled with debris, but they didn't find anything unusual at the time. It is possible that the body was hidden there later, but there is no evidence to confirm this. The investigation initially concentrated on the accounts of witnesses who claimed to have seen Andrea in the company of two teenagers, Robin and David, aged 13 to 14, just before her disappearance. Andrea's vanishing after being seen with Robin and David had seemed suspicious. The boys were questioned again and repeated that they had seen Andrea on the night she disappeared, but had only greeted her and had no involvement in her disappearance. Despite the lack of evidence, but the investigation still points to their involvement in Andrea's disappearance. It seemed unlikely that such young boys could be responsible for her murder, but their involvement couldn't be ruled out entirely. Further investigation revealed that the boys had a connection to the location where Andrea's remains were found. Witnesses had seen Robin and David near the shed on several occasions, and it was discovered that they had access to the inside of the abandoned building. Additionally, eyewitnesses reported seeing the boys at the entrance of the shed on the evening Andrea went missing, raising more questions and increasing suspicions about Robin and David's involvement in the crime. The investigation into the involvement of Robin and David in Andrea's disappearance was dropped due to insufficient evidence and their young age. At the time, detectives didn't think it was plausible for schoolboys to be involved in the crime. The search for Andrea continued. But authorities, media, and her family failed to uncover any valuable information. The case hit a dead end, and it was eventually shelved as unsolved. Without direct evidence pointing to a killer, detectives stopped their search. It wasn't until 2012, when new leadership took over the regional police department, that the case was reopened. Although new evidence and leads were discovered, there still wasn't enough proof to charge anyone. At this point, detectives didn't have a prime suspect. In May 2016, the case took a major turn when David, a 37-year-old man, died in Berlin from a serious pancreatic disease caused by years of drug addiction and unsettled lifestyle. He was one of the teenagers who had last seen Andrea alive. During a train trip, David suffered a fatal internal hemorrhage, and his death certificate listed natural causes, despite his extensive criminal history. Following David's death, a witness came forward to the authorities, claiming to have information that could solve Andrea's murder case. David's mother was a witness, but she concealed the disturbing truth about her son's involvement in the case. She revealed that on the evening of the murder in 1993, David, then 14, and his 13-year-old friend Robin encountered Andrea while walking on the same path. The two boys, drawn to Andrea's fashionable clothing, decided to attack and rob her. When Andrea recognized them in the darkness, fearing they would be exposed, Robin and David brutally killed her. The investigators were shocked by a sudden turn of events. They had previously suspected Robin and David of a crime, but lacked evidence to prosecute them. The boys' involvement was also questionable due to their young age. Until then, the boys, Robin and David, had gotten into only minor scrapes with the law and had managed to avoid punishment due to their youth. No one suspected that this lack of punishment would embolden them to commit more serious crimes. Years later, 36-year-old Robin was brought in for questioning. His former accomplice, David, had since passed away, so the police had to rely on Robin's testimony. Robin confessed to everything, including the gruesome details of the crime. He asked to speak with his family first, to confess to them, before providing a final statement to the investigators. The detectives agreed to give Robin 48 hours to meet with his family, appreciating his willingness to cooperate. However, they had no idea that Robin had already planned his next move. When he returned to his apartment, his wife was temporarily away. Robin left a note for his wife and a message for the police, detailing his involvement in the attack on Andrea Lohagen. Then, he disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, Robin was declared missing after he failed to show up. On November 4, 2016, a hunter discovered his body in the mountains. Robin's mutilated body was found at the bottom of a deep ravine. It appeared that Robin had taken his own life, so unable to cope with the guilt he committed in his youth. In his final note, Robin described the horrific details of the crime. Robin never knew why David started the attack, as David never shared his reasons with him. Despite this, Robin was able to recall the rest of what happened during the incident. According to Robin, they had no prior connection to the victim, Andrea Lohagen. When Andrea was walking along a small road near a club, she met Robin and David. The attack was a sudden and spontaneous act of aggression. Andrea probably chose that route to get to the party quickly and save time. When Robin thought back to the encounter, he remembered exchanging friendly greetings with Andrea alongside his friend David. Initially, Robin intended to continue his journey home, but his plans changed unexpectedly. David suddenly and aggressively attacked Andrea, catching both her and Robin off guard. After the assault, Robin and David concealed Andrea's body in a nearby outbuilding adjacent to the youth center. They covered the body with construction materials and then left the area. According to Robin's account, there was no apparent motive for the attack, such as theft or personal gain. The act seemed to be driven by a senseless and extreme aggression. Robin and David both had encounters with drug dealers while they were in school. Additionally, they were both under the influence of drugs on the night the incident occurred. Peter Lemon, the head of the youth center that Andrea was planning to visit, had fond memories of her. He described Andrea as a well-behaved guest who did not drink alcohol and mainly came to the center to play billiards and socialize with friends. Peter was deeply shocked by the violence against Andrea and provided full cooperation to the authorities investigating the incident. Peter had also been told about Robin and David. They often seen loitering near a shed a short distance from the club. There were numerous negative rumors going around about these boys, but Peter couldn't bring himself to believe that such young people were capable of committing such severe offenses. However, it turned out that these very juveniles had been roaming freely. For 20 years, Andrea's disappearance remained unsolved, despite a written confession from Robin and witness testimonies placing Robin and David near the scene of the crime. The investigation lacked direct evidence against the suspects, with no DNA or fingerprints found. Detectives carefully analyzed every word from Robin, including their social media posts and phone contents. The investigators were looking for clues that might suggest the suspects discussed or admitted to the crime. Shortly before his death, David's online accounts revealed ominous posts that seemed to hint at his involvement in Andrea's disappearance. But these leads were considered secondary evidence. It is presumed that David knew the investigation had reopened and was consumed by guilt. Although he did not intend to surrender to authorities, but his life had spiraled downward due to his struggle with drug addiction. David's mother believed her son's death was a sign from fate. She had been afraid to turn him in to the police, and David and his friend Robin were hesitant to share information about their past due to fear of revenge from people they used to associate with. This fear was legitimate considering David had a record of past violent behavior and convictions for drug crimes. Despite accumulating indirect evidence, one aspect of the case to horrify detectives: how could two ordinary 13 and 14 years old boys commit such a heinous crime against Andrea? As a result, Andrea's relatives and the investigators began to suspect that a third person, an adult, might have been involved in the crime, guiding Robin and David. The investigation revealed that Andrea's death was caused by a severe head injury from a blunt object. The severity of the injury suggests it would have taken considerable physical strength to inflict it. The detectives questioned whether Robin and David could overpower an older girl and inflict such an injury. This led them to consider the possibility of an adult accomplice, which was supported by other evidence. A new suspect emerged, a man associated with Robin and David's social circle, who was significantly older. However, his name was not disclosed. Robin's testimonies and pre-death note did not mention a third accomplice, and David's mother denied the possibility. Despite this, some witness statements suggested an adult was involved. Specifically, several witnesses reported seeing a truck driver around the same age as the suspect near the shed around the time of Andrea's disappearance. Investigators were able to identify this individual and connect him to the case. In reality, Andrea and her killers, Robin and David, attended the same school. However, due to their age difference, they didn't have classes, participate in the same activities, or have common friends. They may have crossed paths in the hallways or cafeteria. Andrea may have had prior conflicts with Robin and David that intensified their dislike for her. Robin and David both came from difficult and unstable families, which led them to start using alcohol and drugs at a young age as a way to cope. On the night of the incident, they may have been under the influence of alcohol or drugs, which could have made them more aggressive. What's more remarkable is that Andrea's remains were found on a plot of land owned by a relative of one of the killers, her ex-boyfriend's grandfather. Some people believe that this resemblance cannot be a coincidence, and they suspect the involvement of her ex-boyfriend in the case. The public was shocked and outraged when it was discovered that these very teenagers were involved in the murder. The revelation led to widespread criticism, mainly because detectives had initially dismissed the case in the 1990s, citing the suspect's youth as the reason. If detectives had investigated these teenagers as suspects at the time of the crimes, it is likely that the victims' bodies would have been discovered much sooner. An earlier investigation could have helped authorities bring the killers to justice. The autopsy results showed that Andrea had a fractured skull, but the object used to inflict the injury could not be identified. The investigation relied only on a few small bones of Andrea. All that remained of the skeleton had decomposed. The investigation into the juvenile criminals relied heavily on testimonies from David's mother and notes from Robin, as no direct physical evidence was available. One of the key concerns for detectives after reopening the case was whether David and Robin had committed any new crimes during the 20-plus years they were free. While it was unlikely, the detectives could not rule out this possibility. They spoke to local residents. However, the detectives did find a history of minor crimes committed by David and Robin. Further investigation into these incidents uncovered disturbing secrets. As detectives looked into Robin's potential involvement in a recent serious crime, they discovered a disturbing incident. In January 2014, a French student named Louise went missing after meeting with friends at the university hospital. Louise had arranged to meet her friends over the phone just before leaving home, but she never arrived. When Louise's friends tried calling her, her phone went unanswered. Assuming Louise had urgent matters to attend to, her friends went home, but when Louise didn't show up for work the next day without explanation, her friends became concerned, as this was unusual for her. Louise was a responsible person, but one evening her phone was unreachable, and her whereabouts were unknown. Later, Louise's body was later discovered, and the primary suspect in her murder was identified as Robin, a juvenile who had previously been linked to the murder of Andrea and had subsequently taken his own life. What made the situation even more disturbing was that Louise personally knew Robin, but she had no idea about his dark past. As a result, she became his second victim. Despite the suspicions, proving Robin's involvement in Louise's murder was difficult due to a lack of direct evidence. The case remains unsolved, and many have criticized police for dropping the investigation into Robin and David, suspects in Andrea's 1993 murder, citing the suspect's young age at the time. The carelessness shown in handling the case allowed criminals to commit new crimes with a high likelihood. Robin's past crimes were neglected, and his case was left unsolved, ultimately leading to the death of Louise. Years earlier, Andrea's body was left to decompose, and her case was also neglected. The Andrea family feels that the young perpetrators didn't get the punishment they deserved for their crimes. Even though the killers are dead, but they were still able to live freely for a time and experience the simple joys of life. The motives behind Andrea's murder, like many other details of the case, remain unknown due to a lack of evidence. This case shows that the idea that young people are not capable of carrying out serious crimes is incorrect. Although the truth will eventually come to light, it may be too late to deliver justice. Andrea's youth, full of promise and dreams for the future, was tragically taken. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Callie Ann Poulton. Callie Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York. She was the only child in her family, and Callie's parents gave her all their attention and love. When Callie was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce, and Callie lived with her mother. Her father maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and visited Callie often. Callie's mother, Judy, moved to an apartment complex in the quiet area suburb of Rochester. Although Judy's ex-husband helped take care of Callie, she still had financial difficulties. When Callie was 4 years old, Judy found a part-time job to save money for a trip to Disney World with Callie the following summer. Judy's job was to deliver magazines to customers in her neighborhood. On the evening of May 23, 1994, Judy was getting ready for her job. Judy was sitting at home, putting flyers in the magazine before going out to socialize. At that time, Callie asked permission to go for a walk because she wanted to ride her tricycle on a beautiful evening. Judy looked outside and saw many other children playing in the yard, so Judy agreed to let her daughter go outside for a few minutes. However, when Judy finished getting ready and went outside to call Callie home, she could not find Callie there. Judy looked around but could not find Callie. She searched the yard and her body but could not find her daughter. She also could not hear Callie's tricycle, although it often made a clear noise. As time passed, Judy's worry increased, and she began asking neighbors if they had seen Callie. Some reported seeing Callie playing with her friends in the yard, but did not know where she went after that. When the neighbors learned that Callie was missing, they joined in the search but were unable to find Callie or her bicycle. Judy believed that her daughter could not have gone anywhere on her own because she had taught Callie to only ride her bike in their yard. Callie had never told her mother, and Callie's little bike could not take her far. Judy also thought that if Callie went out of the yard, she would be discovered immediately. Fearing the worst, Judy decided to contact the police for assistance. Within minutes, the police arrived at the scene and began an urgent search. Firefighters and canine units soon joined the search. The police conducted a house-to-house search and searched the surrounding area. They believed that Callie was still somewhere in the area. Since the kidnapping was a possibility, the police suspected that the kidnappers might be residents of the complex. The reason is that the area has quite strict security controls, so it is unlikely that a stranger would enter the area and snatch Callie out of the yard without anyone noticing. The complex has a total of 300 apartments, and the residents are willing to cooperate with the police, opening their doors for them to search. In case no one is home, the complex manager will provide a spare key for the lock so that the police can check. However, all these efforts do not bring the desired results. No apartment has ever found Callie or her bicycle. The search continued throughout the night, and around 4 a.m., the mission was reclassified as a kidnapping. A special police unit took over the project, and the undercovers asked Judy if there was anyone in their lives who might want to harm them. When the police asked about someone who might be involved in Callie's disappearance, Judy quickly met a man in the apartment complex that made her suspicious. The man, Mark, 22 years old, had just moved in with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. During the conversation with Mark, Judy felt that his actions were very strange. During a conversation, Mark said that Judy's daughter was very beautiful, but his tone of voice made Judy feel uncomfortable. What was more worrying was when Mark said that he had seen all the girls in the apartment complex and thought Callie was the prettiest. Mark once asked Judy a very surprising question. He wanted to know if Callie would talk to Judy if someone tried to touch Callie. Judy answered yes and immediately left the yard. Before that, Callie liked to play with Mark on the playground, but since that conversation, Judy has not let her daughter near him, even when she is present. During the conversation with the secrets, Judy recalled another detail. After she went out to look for Callie, she saw Mark walking out to the playground with his son. She asked him if he had seen Callie, and Mark said no. Judy also noticed something strange, that Mark's sneakers were missing their shoelaces, but she did not pay much attention to it at the time. The police decided to mark the matter and took him to the headquarters to determine some issues. Mark denied any involvement in Callie's disappearance and agreed to take a lie detector test. The test results showed that Mark answered truthfully, so he was released. In addition, Judy accidentally provided an alibi for Mark when she saw him playing with her son on the playground at the exact time she was looking for Callie. The police went to Mark's apartment early in the investigation but did not find Callie or Callie's bike. After eliminating Mark as a suspect, the undercover police continued their investigation. They began to investigate Judy to see if she was involved in Callie's disappearance. Judy understood that this was part of the investigation process and answered all of their questions honestly. Callie's disappearance attracted public attention when information about the incident was broadcast on local newspapers and posted on billboards all over the city. The alert received many calls with information, but after a thorough investigation, all of them turned up nothing. However, Judy did not give up and continued to search for Callie. Judy devoted all her time and energy to finding Callie. She contacted the media and did everything she could to find Callie. Some compassionate people have also come forward to help her, not only helping to distribute flyers but also raising a $100,000 reward for any useful information about Callie's disappearance. Judy was invited to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Callie's disappearance was featured on a popular television show about unsolved cases. The police investigated the case for 2 years without success. Although they gathered some clues, nothing helped them find a solution. On August 9, 1996, when a woman called the police and told them about a serious argument between her and her husband. During the call, the woman said she was tired of her husband's strange behavior and wanted a divorce. The man tried to convince her not to do so, and told her about the difficulties he was facing. Suddenly, the man confessed a terrible secret: he had killed Callie. The woman was shocked and took her child to her father's house immediately. She then called 911 and revealed her husband's name as Mark Christie, who was also Judy's neighbor. The detectives were surprised to hear her story, but they soon encountered a serious problem. Under state law, any information shared between spouses is protected and cannot be used as evidence in court. This means that even if Mark tells the truth, the police cannot arrest or question him. Furthermore, the police recalled that Mark's apartment was searched in the early hours of the investigation, and he was in the yard with his child shortly after Callie went missing. This led the police to suspect that Mark did not have enough time to kidnap and kill Callie. After listening to Mark's wife's story, Detective Crow decided to find out more information. Through the investigation, Crow discovered that Mark and his family had moved out of the apartment complex just weeks after Callie went missing. Because the parents of the 2 girls accused Mark of standing naked in front of their house in full view. However, no formal investigation was conducted into this, because by law, Mark was standing in his own home. However, Mark's actions have raised considerable suspicion in the detective's mind. When Detective Crow visits Mark in another city 50 miles from Rochester, he is stopped by Mark's mother. She refuses to allow the detective to see Mark and demands the presence of a lawyer. Mark's mother states that her son will not answer any questions without his lawyer present. Mark seems to know about his wife's report to the police, and Detective Crow realizes that there is little he can do in this situation. Mark's confession to his wife cannot be used as evidence in court. However, Detective Crow is not giving up yet. While talking to Mark's mother, he convinces Mark to agree to answer some questions about Callie's case. Crow suggests that they go to a nearby restaurant and chat over coffee. Mark agrees, but only if Crow takes him to see his lawyer afterward. They stop at a nearby Italian restaurant. During this time, Detective Crow chatted with Mark in a friendly manner, trying not to pressure him. The tactic worked, and Mark began to speak. He expressed remorse for what he had done to Callie, saying that his actions had haunted him for the past 2 years. According to Crow, Mark kept seeing Callie's picture in newspapers and flyers, and her face seemed to follow him everywhere. To avoid scaring Mark, Crow approached the conversation cautiously. Although he had known Mark since the early days of the investigation, this was not their first conversation. Crow told Mark that he had fooled the entire police team. Mark responded that he did not want to boast, but the way he had disposed of the bike was very clever. Mark asked Crow if he wanted to know the details, but he warned that he would only talk about the bike and not reveal any more information. Crow tried to keep his tone light and friendly to avoid scaring Mark and gather as much information as possible. Mark wanted Crow to know that Callie's tricycle had been stored in his apartment for 3 days since Callie had gone missing. Mark knew that the police would search all apartments without a warrant because it was protocol when a child was in danger. Mark quickly decided to disassemble the bike into small parts and hide them in hard-to-find places in the apartment. Mark carefully hid some of the parts in his clothes and put them in the closet, while the other parts were put in small bags and hidden in his car. Mark then slowly disposed of these bags, storing them in places far from the apartment. During this time, the police were stationed at the exit of the apartment complex, checking each bike. Since they were only looking for Callie, these small bags did not attract their attention. Detective Crow sees an opportunity to get a full confession from Mark. So he begins to tell Mark that Callie's death may not have been his fault, but a tragic accident. Mark asks what sentence he could face, and Crow suggests that it could be around 25 years. Mark argues that it would be unfair for him to spend half his life behind bars, away from his wife and son. He also says that he has been living with his own personal grief for the past 2 years, and that should be taken into account when making a decision. Although these words may seem like an excuse, Crow continues his tactics. He advises Mark to ease his grief and tell what really happened. Mark says that he is willing to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Crow understands that the lawyer will not allow Mark to confess to the crime without evidence against him. So Crow told Mark that if he did not tell the truth, Callie's parents would never know what happened to Callie, or whether Callie suffered before she died. Mark replied, "Callie did not suffer." Crow felt that Mark was ready to confess, so he advised Mark to do the right thing for himself, his family, and God. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at Crow and finally admitted his crime. He reiterated that Callie did not suffer and confessed that he had strangled Callie. Mark added to his story that he had not done anything bad to Callie. However, Mark said that evening, Callie came to his apartment and wanted to play with her 1.5-year-old son. Since he knew that Callie's mother would not agree to her coming to his house, Mark decided to keep quiet about it. When Callie entered the apartment, Callie went upstairs and went into the room to play with Mark's child. After about 10 minutes, Mark heard Callie's mother calling her name in the yard and became worried. Mark feared that Callie's mother would be angry that he had allowed her into the house without permission. Mark decided to go up to and strangle Callie with his bare hands. Detective Crow questioned the accuracy of this story. It seemed that Mark had intended to lure Callie into his apartment by taking advantage of his wife's absence, and the excuse of playing with his son may have been just an excuse. There, Mark may have approached Callie, and when he heard Judy calling Callie's name, he feared that Callie would reveal what had just happened. In addition, Crow also recalled the detail that Judy had seen him wearing sneakers without laces, which he could have used as a deadly instrument. This means that the crime was not spontaneous, but planned by Mark. Mark tried to minimize the severity of his crime by changing some details in the story. But Detective Crow understood that if he spoke out his suspicions, Mark might change his mind and refuse to talk about what he did to Callie. So Detective Crow continued to act and listen to the story. Mark claimed that after the murder, he carried Callie's body into the kitchen and left her on the floor. He then took his son outside to create an alibi for himself in order to divert the police's suspicions. Mark knew that Judy was calling his daughter's name in the yard. In order not to arouse suspicion, Mark wanted Judy to see him. Mark then returned home and placed the laundry basket on top of Callie's body, covering it with clothes. After a few minutes, he put the basket in the trunk of his car and took his son to work. At that time, many people were searching for Callie and no one paid attention to Mark. When he arrived at the company, Mark parked his car and left the laundry basket at the back door of the building. Then he drove forward, then Mark turned back and lied to his co-workers that he had forgotten something at work to cover up his actions. Then Mark climbed onto a tank of liquid coolant and dropped Callie in, before tying a heavy metal object to Callie. Then Mark threw away Callie's clothes, but did not remove Callie earrings. Finally, Mark returned home and joined the search for Callie with other neighbors. Mark took Callie's body out of his workplace before the police arrived to investigate. When confessing his crime, Mark said that killing Callie was a big mistake. After providing the necessary information to Detective Crow, Mark paid for the meal and left a $2 tip. He then accompanied the detective to the police station and was arrested for murder. Mark's attorney attempted to withdraw his confession, but was unsuccessful. Since Mark had volunteered the information, Detective Crow had not broken any laws. Mark's confession was still admissible. The police went to Mark's workplace and opened the box containing Callie's body. 2 years after Mark killed Callie, Callie's body was still in the box. Due to the high level of decomposition, experts were unable to determine the cause of death or any other details. They were only able to confirm the victim's identity, and Callie's family was finally able to bury Callie. Mark pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. Mark's lawyer had previously negotiated a deal that would see the kidnapping charges dropped and Mark would face only the murder charge. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Jennifer Londano. Jennifer Londano, a 31-year-old engaged and responsible individual, failed to arrive at her job in Englewood, New Jersey, prompting concerns from her family and friends. As the manager of the newly opened Luna Lounge on Armory Street, Jennifer was a diligent worker with a spotless attendance record. However, on June 25, 2017, she vanished without a trace after closing the bar in the early morning hours. When she didn't show up for her shift that evening, her co-workers grew worried and attempted to contact her. But her phone was switched off, which was unusual because she always maintained regular communication with them. This lack of response heightening their anxiety, her loved ones decided to file a missing person report with the police, highlighting that she always checked in with them before going anywhere. As the investigation began, police visited Jennifer's apartment, where she lived alone. The officers found the front door locked with no signs of forced entry or damage. Upon entering the apartment, they initially noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The space was clean and well-maintained, with no signs of disarray or theft. At first glance, nothing suggested that the apartment was a crime scene. After investigating Jennifer's apartment and finding no leads, the police visited the bar where she worked as a manager to gather more information. They spoke with the staff at the establishment and discovered that Jennifer was well-liked by everyone, with no reported conflicts with patrons or employees. Her co-workers described her as kind, helpful, and highly respected. Jennifer was a driven and ambitious person who had a strong work ethic. In 2016, she partnered with 40-year-old Rafael Lolos to open the Luna Lounge in Englewood, New Jersey. The bar was successful, thanks in part to Jennifer's exceptional people skills and management abilities. Lolo's provided the financial backing, while Jennifer was the face of the business, charming customers with her warm personality. What the police discovered during their conversation with the bar staff was that Jennifer and Raphael's relationship went beyond business. They were romantically involved, and their relationship was public knowledge. Despite their close relationship, they had not yet taken the step of living together. The investigation revealed that on the morning Jennifer was last seen, she had closed the bar and gotten into Raphael's car, which was waiting for her after work. As the last person to see her, Raphael became a key person of interest, and the detectives decided to bring him in for questioning. Raphael claimed that he drove Jennifer home from work after she closed the bar, and they spent some time together at her apartment before he left to let her rest for a shift that evening. Following her disappearance, Raphael maintained contact with Jennifer's family and collaborated with them to try to determine her whereabouts. Since there was no apparent connection between Raphael and Jennifer's disappearance, the police concentrated on investigating other leads. However, they faced challenges due to Jennifer's phone being turned off on the day she disappeared, with the last signal coming from a cell tower near her home. Neighborhood interviews yielded no suspicious information. As part of the investigation, the police requested banking records, as they often provide crucial clues in such cases. When the bank shared the data, it revealed an unexpected development: Jennifer's bank card had been used even after she went missing. The investigation led detectives to suspect that Jennifer was intentionally hiding, but her family strongly disagreed, convinced that she would never willingly cause them distress. To gather more information, the police began to investigate the activity on her card, seeking to determine when, where, and how it was used. 2 days after Jennifer's disappearance, on June 27th, a pedestrian walking along Pier 44 in Brooklyn noticed something unusual in the water. The person stared at the object for a while, unable to identify it, before realizing with shock that it was a human body, or at least part of one. The police were summoned to the scene, and the pier was sealed off. A thorough search by divers yielded no additional body parts or evidence. The police faced a daunting challenge in identifying the victim, but a potential lead emerged. A tattoo was discovered on the victim's right thigh during a forensic examination. The tattoo, which may have belonged to the victim, was partially translated from Sanskrit, an ancient Indian language with complex grammar. The police released an image of the tattoo, hoping someone would recognize it and provide information. Investigations revealed that the tattoo's inscription was Sanskrit, but incorrectly written. The tattoo artist and the victim seemed to intend to write Liliana, but did so with grammatical errors, suggesting neither of them was familiar with the language. For days after the initial gruesome discovery, police received another disturbing call from a passerby who spotted a leg on the riverbank near 79th Street. Police immediately cordoned off the area and pulled the leg out of the water. The leg, which was intact from the knee down, seemed to match the remains found earlier, leading investigators to believe they belonged to the same person. A notable detail was the pink-painted fingernails on the leg. Despite an extensive search by divers in the area, no other remains or evidence were found. However, forensic analysis soon confirmed that the fragments found were indeed from the same body. Around this time, the police had already identified the victim. A few days after releasing an image of the distinctive tattoo, a woman contacted the police station and revealed that she knew the tattoo's owner. It was Jennifer's mother, Gladys Quintero, who recognized the tattoo on the news and recognized it as belonging to her daughter. The tattoo, it turned out, was a tribute to Jennifer's late aunt and symbolized the name Lily or Liliana. Jennifer's mother to New York to identify human remains. When it was confirmed that the remains were Jennifer's, the family was left shattered. The discovery marked a significant turn in the case, transforming a missing person investigation into a homicide probe. The family was not only grief-stricken by Jennifer's death, but also horrified by the brutal circumstances surrounding it. Unfortunately, due to the state of the remains, it was impossible to determine the exact cause of death. Despite an extensive search, the police were unable to recover additional body parts. As family and friends paid their respects to Jennifer at her workplace, the bar, detectives were making progress in their investigation. They tracked down leads on Jennifer's credit card usage. Through a thorough review of security footage and store visits, detectives identified the person who had used Jennifer's credit card, Raphael, Jennifer's boyfriend. They discovered that Raphael had left Jennifer's apartment on the day she disappeared to go shopping. His purchases, made with Jennifer's credit card, included a box of garbage bags and 2 meat cleavers from different stores. Later that evening, he crossed the George Washington Bridge into Manhattan, and his cell phone records placed him near the Hudson River. Raphael went home after leaving Jennifer's apartment and never returned. 2 days later, Jennifer's torso was discovered. The police suspected that Raphael might have killed her and dismembered her body using meat cleavers, a disturbing thought considering their romantic relationship. However, the evidence pointing to Raphael's guilt was mounting. As a result, the police obtained an arrest warrant and a search warrant for his home, anticipating that they would soon apprehend him. Raphael attempted to evade capture by renting a hotel room and paying in cash, but he was quickly tracked down and arrested. He did not resist arrest and denied any involvement in Jennifer's death, claiming that Jennifer had given him her credit card. Raphael continued to insist that Jennifer was fine when he left her, but detectives uncovered more evidence that contradicted his testimony. A search of his home revealed dark red stains in the bathroom, which were later confirmed by a lab test to be Jennifer's dried blood. Detectives investigating Jennifer's disappearance analyzed her communications with Raphael and found a pattern of frequent arguments, typically sparked by jealousy. A search of Raphael's home uncovered a box sent via post office and a bag that had previously contained a GPS tracking device. It became clear that Raphael had secretly installed the device on Jennifer's car, allowing him to monitor her movements. Cell phone data revealed that Raphael had picked Jennifer up from work and taken her to her apartment. Although Jennifer's phone was soon turned off, Raphael's phone remained active. Between 9 p.m. and midnight on the day of her disappearance, his phone sent a signal to a cell tower near the Hudson River. This suggests that Jennifer may have already been dead by then, and Raphael may have driven to the river to dispose of her body. Raphael and Jennifer's relationship was complex and tumultuous, with conflicts often centered on financial issues. Despite their efforts to establish a business together, opening a bar less than a year before her disappearance, their relationship was marked by animosity and blurred boundaries. Raphael's messages to Jennifer were volatile, veering between insults, threats, apologies, and declarations of love, with one notable instance where he referred to her as a gold digger. Jennifer's family was shocked and disbelieving when the man who had claimed to love her and helped search for her became the prime suspect in her murder. Raphael refused to explain himself, denied any wrongdoing, and hired a lawyer. Although police couldn't find the exact knives they knew Raphael had bought, they were able to purchase identical ones from the same store. Forensic analysis later confirmed that these knives were used to harm Jennifer's body. Raphael was subsequently charged with several crimes, including murder, desecration of remains, stalking, hindering apprehension, and credit card fraud. The trial, which began in November 2019, lasted for 2 months. Prosecutors claimed that Jennifer was killed by Raphael in her apartment during a jealous argument. Raphael's lawyers argued that the state had no concrete evidence to prove their claim, pointing out that there were no signs of a struggle in the apartment and no marks in the bathtub where Jennifer was allegedly dismembered. The prosecution countered that the lack of evidence was, in itself, evidence of a cover-up. The absence of any signs of a crime suggested that Raphael had made a deliberate effort to conceal his tracks. The bathtub, in particular, was found to be remarkably clean, with no DNA or physical evidence linking Jennifer to the scene. The prosecutor pointed out that an ordinary person's bathtub would not be as clean as the one in question. During the trial, Jennifer's mother emotionally addressed the judge, stating that the defendant had destroyed her life and her family. She emphasized that Jennifer was her beloved daughter, and the defendant's actions had left her devastated. After reviewing the case, the judge determined that Raphael was consumed by an obsession with Jennifer. When given the opportunity to speak, Raphael refused, only communicating with his lawyer. In December 2019, the jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Raphael guilty on all charges. The verdict was officially announced in February 2020. As a result, 43-year-old Raphael received the maximum sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 63 years. This means he will be 106 years old before he can be considered for parole. Unfortunately, the remainder of Jennifer's body was never. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Natasha Kornoyer. Natasha Kornoyer, 37 years old, has gone missing suddenly and without any notice. She didn't visit her mother, respond to phone calls, or return home. As the day went on, it became clear that none of her friends or colleagues had seen her either. Her worried relatives reported her missing at 5 p.m., prompting a police investigation. Natasha worked as a public relations specialist for the Correctional Service of Canada. Detectives began by interviewing her co-workers. Upon arrival, they found her car still parked nearby. A nervous-looking man, Michel Trottier, was standing by her vehicle. He claimed to be in a relationship with Natasha and was trying to figure out where she might have gone. The back door of Natasha's car had scratches, but it was unclear if they were related to her disappearance. With no reason to suspect Michel Trottier of involvement, detectives continued their investigation. Co-workers reported that Natasha was at work on October 1, 2009, the day before she vanished. She seemed to be in a good mood, friendly, and untroubled, with no signs of anything amiss. On October 2nd, Natasha needed a day off to deal with issues related to her recently deceased father's tombstone. To make up for time, she worked longer hours on October 1st and left the office around 8 p.m. According to her friends, Natasha was a kind and open person with no known conflicts or enemies. The police launched a large-scale search for Natasha, involving aviation and canine units. Initially, they focused on the area around the parking lot but found no clues to aid the investigation. Natasha's friends and relatives distributed flyers with her photo, hoping someone might have information about her disappearance. The first few hours after a person goes missing are crucial in finding witnesses or evidence. However, in Natasha's case, valuable time was lost because the police weren't notified until the evening of October 2nd, 21 hours after she left work. The search for Natasha took place from October 3rd to 5th, but unfortunately, no leads were found. Her family offered a $10,000 reward for any information that could help locate her. Natasha's boyfriend, Michel Trottier, suspected she had been kidnapped and made a televised plea for her safe release. Meanwhile, the police were investigating their personal lives. They had been together for 4 years, but their relationship had been rocky, with multiple breakups and reconciliations. The police explored all possible scenarios surrounding Natasha's disappearance. They reviewed CCTV footage from her workplace, both inside and outside the building. The footage showed Natasha arriving at 9:04 a.m. and leaving at 8:07 p.m. She had parked her car in a poorly lit area of the parking lot, and the cameras captured her walking towards it. However, she eventually disappeared from view due to the darkness. After a few minutes, the car headlights turned on and the car started moving, but instead of heading towards the exit, it drove to the opposite side of the parking lot, which was also poorly lit. The car stopped and the headlights went out. The vehicle remained in this position for about 20 minutes before moving towards the exit. It was determined that this car was not Natasha's, as she owned a Mazda. Further investigation revealed that the car in the video was a Ford Windstar minivan, which had entered the parking lot at 6:35 p.m. and parked next to Natasha's car. Based on the video footage, the police concluded that Natasha Conoyer's disappearance was likely a kidnapping. On the fifth day of the search, October 6, 2009, the focus shifted from finding a missing person to investigating a homicide. Natasha's body was discovered in a vacant lot in the Point Aux Trumbull area, approximately 20 miles from her workplace. The body was located next to a dirt road that led to the riverbank. The news of Natasha's death devastated her relatives and friends, who were further disturbed by the medical examiner's report. According to the report, Natasha's cause of death was strangulation. Additionally, she had suffered 9 facial injuries, including a broken nose, and had marks on her wrists and ankles indicating that she had been bound. Seminal fluid was also found inside her body, which would serve as a source of DNA evidence. While awaiting DNA analysis results, detectives attempted to identify the owner of a minivan captured on camera the day Natasha vanished. In 2009, there were 2 motels near Natasha's workplace. On October 16, 2009, 10 days after her body was discovered, police visited both motels to review guest registration cards. At the Lido Motel, they found a guest who had registered a Ford Windstar. The guest was 48 years old Claude LaRouche, a registered sex offender with 2 prior convictions. In 1993, Claude was sentenced to 1 year in prison and 2 years of probation for coercing a 19-year-old acquaintance into sex. In 2005, he received a 40-month prison sentence for attempting to kidnap a 7-year-old girl. She managed to escape and run to a neighbor's house. Claude's 40-month sentence for the attempted kidnapping of a child raises questions about the severity of his punishment. In November 2008, Claude was released and started working as a carpenter. He married a woman with 2 sons, and they all lived together in a house about a 10-minute drive from where Natasha Conoyer disappeared. Detectives found out Claude checked into a motel the night Natasha went missing. Forensic experts examined the motel room and discovered dark red stains on the carpet, which they sent for analysis. The same day, detectives visited Claude at his home. Since he had a prior prison record, the police already had his DNA on file. However, they needed time to compare it to the DNA found on Natasha's body. Claude claimed he didn't know Natasha but admitted to frequently visiting the Lido Motel because it was cheap. He told the detectives he was unhappy with his intimate life with his wife and often rented a motel room to meet women offering paid sex services. When asked about his whereabouts on October 1st, the day Natasha disappeared, Claude said he couldn't remember anything, including staying at the Lido Motel. He attributed his memory loss to excessive substance use, but his memory partially returned soon after. On November 5, 2009, a month after the body was discovered, detectives returned to Claude LaRouche's house. This time, however, it was not for a conversation. DNA analysis revealed that the seminal fluid found in Natasha Conoyer's body matched LaRouche's. Additionally, Natasha's DNA was detected in the motel room Claude rented and inside his car. Montreal police say there's no link between the crime and Conoyer's job at Correctional Service of Canada, and the victim didn't know the suspect. Following Claude's arrest, Montreal Police Inspector Daniel Rousseau stated that citizens could now feel safer in public. The news of the arrest shocked Claude's neighbors, who described him as a friendly and polite individual. The next day, on November 6, 2009, Claude LaRouche became a suspect in Natasha Conoyer's case. Initially, he denied any wrongdoing, but faced with substantial evidence, he confessed to taking Natasha's life. However, He claimed her death was accidental and not intentional. During his 2011 trial, two differing accounts of the events emerged, one from Claude and his defense team, and the other from the prosecution. According to Claude's testimony, he was waiting in a parking lot for a drug dealer on the evening in question. While sitting in his car, Natasha appeared beside him. He then attacked her, forced her into his vehicle, and shut the door. Afterwards, Claude conversed with Natasha, and she allegedly agreed to accompany him to a motel. Claude LaRouche experienced memory lapses, which left him unable to recall why he stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes or what he did during that time. However, he conveniently remembered specific moments that worked in his favor. According to LaRouche, Natasha offered to satisfy his demands in exchange for her freedom while they were in the motel room. He agreed, but after she fulfilled his requests, they got into an argument. Claude lost control, attacked Natasha, and ultimately strangled her. He then cleaned the room, moved her body to his car, drove home, and went to bed. The next morning, after the substances he had taken wore off, he realized the gravity of his actions. Claude chose to get rid of Natasha's body. As he drove to the location where the body was later found, he cut her documents and bank cards into pieces and threw them out the car window. However, it's crucial to remember that this account comes from LaRouche himself, and the more he shared, the more inconsistencies and questions emerged about his claims. According to Claude's testimony, the day after disposing of Natasha's body, he returned to the scene and covered her with a blanket, fearing she would freeze. He revisited the body again the next day to retrieve the blanket, worried that it would hinder her discovery. LaRouche's statements suggest that his actions were influenced by a clouded consciousness, leading to illogical decisions. He claimed he did not intend to take Natasha's life, which he attempted to convey to those present during the trial. The prosecution's case relied on physical evidence and a witness testimony. The witness stated that while walking his dog near the parking lot on the day Natasha disappeared, he saw Claude attempt to attack a jogger around 7 p.m. However, Claude retreated when he noticed the witness and his dog. Natasha Conoyer was attacked an hour later. The prosecutor was convinced that Claude had bound and abducted Natasha, taking her to a motel where she ultimately lost her life. In June 2011, Claude LaRouche was found guilty and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. During the trial, it was revealed that just 2 weeks after Natasha's murder, Claude attempted to strangle another woman, Dominique Martel. However, she managed to fend him off by biting his finger. As a result, Claude was deemed a dangerous offender under Canadian law, rendering his prison sentence indefinite and significantly reducing his chances of early parole. Natasha had a peaceful and fulfilling life, with aspirations and objectives, all of which were brutally taken away by a man with a history of serious crimes. Despite his past, Claude was allowed to roam free, living among the community without adequate supervision. The fact that he had previously attempted to kidnap a 7-year-old girl raises questions about how he was able to reintegrate into society without proper monitoring. Natasha's loved ones continue to grapple with these unanswered questions, haunted by the thought that if the system had functioned correctly and Claude had been held accountable, Natasha might still be alive today. Hi there, investigators. It's time to uncover the truth behind another case. The case of Jake Wagner. Hannah Mae Roden, 13, and Edward Jake Wagner, 18, met at a dance and quickly became lovers. As a result, the Roden and Wagner families began to spend time together, sharing weekends and parties, and Hannah Mae and Jake's love continued to grow. When Hannah Mae turned 15 years old, she revealed that she was pregnant. Jake was delighted with the news and hoped his family would be too. The Wagner family placed great emphasis on tradition and family lineage, and they adored children, viewing them as a continuation of their traditions. In fact, they often passed the name down from generation to generation, as seen in Jake's family, with his father being George Wagner III and his brother George Wagner IV. On the other hand, the Roden family had a more practical approach to family life. Even though they were divorced, Christopher Roden Sr. and Dana Roden remained close and devoted to their 3 children, prioritizing their happiness above all else. Unlike the Wagner family, the Rodens lived modestly, with Christopher working odd jobs and Dana as a nurse's assistant. Despite economic limitations, the Roden family instilled strong traditional values in their children, including Christopher Jr., Hannah Mae, and Clarence Frankie. The family was overjoyed when Hannah Mae gave birth to a daughter named Sophie, and they threw a big party. However, when Jake asked Hannah Mae to move in with him and his family, she refused. She became increasingly wary of Jake due to his increasingly controlling and aggressive behavior. Hannah Mae was initially attracted to Jake's caring and thoughtful nature, but over time, she realized that Jake was trying to limit her independence. Jake's aggression repeatedly caused Hannah Mae's feelings for him to cool. Her refusal to move in with Jake created tension with him. Jake believed that Hannah Mae was preventing Sophie from growing up in a safe and healthy environment. Despite Hannah Mae's denials, Jake became increasingly controlling. Hannah Mae finally ended the relationship in March 2015, tired of Jake's aggressive behavior. At that point, the Wagner family wanted sole custody of Sophie. Jake had to put in a lot of effort to convince Hannah Mae to sign over custody of the children to him and his brother. However, Hannah Mae refused. In a heated exchange, Jake angrily sent a text message saying that if necessary, he would use force to gain custody of Sophie. This revelation confirmed the Wagner family's willingness to use coercion and intimidation to achieve their goals. To protect herself and her daughter from this unscrupulous family, Hannah decided to distance herself and raise her child alone. She chose to work as a nursing assistant, continued her studies, and took care of Sophie herself. The situation escalated when Hannah became pregnant again. Although Hannah confirmed that the child was not Jake's, he still had doubts and tried to discover the truth. In December 2015, Jake logged into Hannah's social media accounts but found no evidence of an affair. A trial ensued, involving repeated interactions between the Wagner family and Hannah. In one text message, Hannah asserted that the Wagner family would have to get rid of her before they could gain custody of Sophie. Jake shared this letter with his family, angering them. His grandmother, Rita Newcomb, 65, retaliated by forging an important custody-related document. During the custody trial for Sophie, Christopher Roden and George Wagner III had a heated argument. This incident caused a complete rift in the relationship between the two families. The Wagner family soon came up with a terrible idea. They believed that Hannah Roden was uncooperative and decided that the only solution was to eliminate her and the entire Roden family in order to gain custody of Sophie. By Christmas 2016, this twisted idea was the start of a terrible crime. While everyone focused on love and celebration during the holiday season, the Wagner family had other intentions. They held a family vote to decide whether to continue with their evil plan or not. After everyone agreed, they assigned each person roles and began preparing. The Wagner family spent 5 months researching the Roden family home, including surveillance cameras, daily habits, and work schedules of each Roden family member. Each member of the Wagner family was assigned a specific task. Angela Wagner purchased a communications blocking device and planned to secretly install it on the Roden family's phone to prevent anyone from being able to contact the police. George Wagner III offered to build a homemade silencer and handle transportation the night of the crime, securing a truck and not attracting attention. Meanwhile, Sophie was safe at home with Angela because the court had awarded Hannah and Jake joint custody of Sophie. The Wagner family chose the time when it was their turn to care for Sophie in order to keep Sophie safe. It was clear that the Wagner family had meticulously planned every detail to carry out a perfect execution. At approximately 8 a.m. on April 22, 2016, George Wagner III visited Christopher Roden under the pretense of offering Christopher a job opportunity that could improve his family's financial situation. However, the job offer was just an excuse to get into the house. A moment later, Christopher Roden Sr. opened the door. A while later, as usual, Bobby Jo Manley arrived at Christopher's house to take care of the Roden family's animals. While outside the house, she noticed someone was inside, which was unusual for that time of day. Every member of the Roden family usually went about their work and was not at home. However, when she entered the house, she found Christopher and his cousin Gary, 38, lying in a pool of blood. Horrified, Bobby grabbed the phone and called emergency services, reporting what she had seen and asking for assistance. Still shaking, Bobby went to other relatives' houses and knocked loudly on one of their doors. A 3-year-old boy, the son of Clarence Frankie Roden, appeared, and Bobby asked him where his parents were. However, the boy did not respond but just pointed towards the bed. When she entered the house, she witnessed another horrifying scene. Clarence and his wife, Hannah Hazel, lay motionless. Lying between them was their 6-month-old baby, still alive but covered in the blood of Clarence and Hannah Hazel. After Bobby's 911 call, police quickly arrived on the scene. As the officers approached the Roden property, a neighbor intervened, sensing worried. He requested that the officers check 2 additional addresses of family members. His concern was justified, as police found bloodied bodies in the 3rd house. The victims were identified as Dana, 19-year-old Hannah Mae, and 16-year-old Christopher Jr. The attackers had spared Hannah's youngest child, a baby girl only a few days old. Later, another victim was discovered, 44-year-old Kenneth, the elder Roden's brother, who lived a 15-minute walk from the others. By 2 p.m., 8 victims had been identified: Christopher Sr., Dana, Clarence, Hannah Hazel, Christopher Jr., Hannah Mae, Kenneth, and Gary. The only survivors were young children, a 3-year-old, a 6-month-old and a 4-day-old newborn, along with 2-year-old Sophie, who was at the Wagner home at the time of the incident. After examining the bodies, police concluded that all the victims had been killed in their sleep by gunshot wounds. Detectives later reconstructed the events of that day. Christopher Sr. was awake when the attackers burst into the house, as evidenced by a wound on his right arm. Christopher Sr. attempted to defend himself but was hit with 9 shots to the head, torso, and limbs. In addition, 5 bullets were removed from Dana Roden's neck and head. The rest of the family died from gunshot wounds to the head. Gary was shot 5 times, Christopher Jr. 4 times, Clarence and his wife Hannah Hazel 3 times each, and Hannah Mae twice. Kenneth was the only one shot once. In total, the assailant fired 32 shots, with some shots fired after the victims were already dead. Some bodies also showed signs of physical abuse. Since no one in the area heard anything, investigators believe the perpetrators used silencers, indicating a carefully planned and executed act. It was clear that the victims were targeted, and someone wanted revenge on the entire Roden family. During the search, police found 5 Remington shell casings of different types and an unused bullet from a different gun model. The scale of the case shows that this was a case with multiple murderers. Leonard Manley, Dana's father, claimed that the criminals must have known the family well, or the dogs would have been barking loudly. The question of who committed this act kept police officers busy. The Attorney General's office provided over $20,000 for the Roden family's funeral. Roden family were buried in several stages. On April 28, 2016, Gary was the first to be laid to rest in South Shore, Kentucky. Hannah Hazel's funeral followed on May 1 in the village of Atway, Coteau County, Ohio. The remaining members were buried on May 3 in West Portsmouth, in the same county. Many local residents attended to pay their respects to the family. The surviving children were placed in the care of relatives. The neighborhood was gripped by fear. Police advised relatives of the victims to take precautions and warned all residents of Pike to stay their homes at night. The brutal mass murder outraged residents across the state, who demanded that the investigation's findings be made public and the perpetrators be caught as soon as possible. As part of the investigation, the murdered family's 3 homes had been investigated, followed by several more vehicles the following day. Forensic experts had participated in the investigation and had meticulously examined the homes, but no DNA evidence of the suspects had been found in any of the homes. Cameras had been installed in the houses, but they had not provided any useful information because they had been disabled. It seemed the culprit had planned every detail carefully, leaving no clues behind. However, detectives eventually discovered a key piece of evidence that had helped solve the case. An important detail was that marijuana plants were discovered at 3 crime scenes. At one location, around 200 plants were found. The police believed the cannabis was grown for sale rather than personal use. This led to speculation about the involvement of Mexican drug traffickers. However, the amount of cannabis found was too small to suggest an attack by an entire cartel. In January 2017, a close relative of the Roden family was arrested for drug trafficking. This was considered a coincidental circumstance. Leonard Manley stated that his daughter, Dana, had no involvement with the cannabis operations. Some family members confirmed that the older brothers, Christopher and Kenneth Roden, grew marijuana, but they were unaware of any large-scale cultivation. Specialized equipment for breeding chickens for fighting, as well as cages with roosters, were found at the Rodens' house. However, it soon became clear that illegal cockfighting was not the cause of the homicides either. Months went by without uncovering the true motive behind the crime. On April 13, 2017, local authorities announced they lacked sufficient evidence to make any arrests. Nevertheless, Prosecutor Rob Yum stated the investigation was ongoing, suggesting they had some leads they were not yet ready to disclose. Another year had passed since the mass crime occurred, and its second memorial service went largely unnoticed. There was no coverage in the local press, and neither the sheriff or the prosecutor attended the memorial service. This led the community to believe that the investigation had stalled. However, on May 12, 2017, a special weapons and tactics team unexpectedly raided a home in Pike County, about 10 miles from the crime scene. Initially, they were searching for suspects, but it was later revealed that they were gathering evidence. Detectives also searched a house in Adams County that had once been owned by Jake Wagner, although he had sold it by then. The investigation took a dramatic turn on June 20, 2017, when the focus shifted to the Wagner family. The investigation included 26-year-old Jake, 27-year-old George III, 47-year-old George IV, and 48-year-old Angela, who lived approximately 15 miles from the victim. The Wagner family moved to Kenai, Alaska, claiming they were struggling to stay in the area. The Wagner family expressed their love for the Roden family, saying their deaths had devastated the Wagner family. The investigation indeed had a breakthrough. Authorities were seeking information from the public about the Wagner family's dealings in guns, ammunition, vehicles, and other related topics. According to the investigation, every family member was involved in the crime that occurred on November 13, 2018. The Attorney General announced that the Wagners and their sons had been arrested and charged with planning and carrying out the murder. Rita Newcomb, the 65-year-old mother of Angela, and Frida Wagner, the mother of George Wagner III, had also been arrested for perjury and obstruction of justice. In 2019, Rita Newcomb had undergone handwriting analysis to confirm her role in forging guardianship documents for Sophie. To avoid going to jail, she had entered a plea deal. As a result, the charges against Frederica Wagner were dropped in June 2019. 2 years later, on April 22, 2021, Jake had reached an agreement with the prosecution. In exchange for revealing details of the crime, all family members would receive life sentences instead of the death penalty. Jake had admitted to killing 5 of the 8 individuals and had received 23 criminal charges, including 8 felonies. The remaining charges had included theft, conspiracy, illegal possession of ammunition, forgery, interception of messages, unlawful use of property, obstruction of justice, corrupt activities, and unlawful intimate conduct with a young woman. Jake had explained that he saw eliminating Hannah Mae as the only way to ensure custody of his daughter. He believed that if he did not kill the entire Roden family, they would seek revenge and refuse to give custody of Sophie to him. Angela was next to face trial on September 10th. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy, aggravated robbery, and tampering with evidence. In exchange for her testimony against the other defendants, the murder charge was dropped. Angela received a sentence of 30 years in prison. The trial of George Wagner had begun on August 28, 2022. Although he denied any involvement in the crime, the prosecution presented evidence of his participation in the planning, execution, and cover-up. Ultimately, George 4 was found guilty on 22 counts and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. George 3's trial was scheduled for February 2024. Despite the convictions of his family members, he maintained his innocence. The once harmonious family's descent into madness was baffling, and their actions were unforgivable. The actions of the Wagner family left 3 children orphaned, depriving them of the love of their parents, relatives, and a peaceful life. One couldn't help but wonder what Sophie would be like when she grew up and realized what had happened. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Sheil Kovlin. Sheil Kovlin grew up on the west side of Manhattan. Shelley's life was marked by a love of learning and academic excellence, earning a degree in wealth management. This degree opened the door to a successful career in Swiss banking. Sheil's career flourished, and she became skilled at managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for her clients. However, despite her professional success and financial security, Sheil felt unfulfilled. She longed to start a family of her own and become a mother. In an effort to change her circumstances, Sheil attended a Jewish singles event in February 1998, where she met a 26-year-old man named Rod Kovlin, who also worked in the banking sector. Sheil and Rod were a young couple with many similar interests and ambitions. Their relationship developed quickly despite their significant age difference. They spent all their time together and then decided to get married, feeling that everything was just right. Some people thought they were rushing into marriage, but for Sheil and Rod, it was perfect. They had 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl, and their family was complete. However, their happy life was shattered on New Year's Eve 2009 when Sheil died in a tragic accident. At first, the police thought it was just a freak accident. On December 30, 2009, 2 police officers were finishing their night shift at a Manhattan police station. They received an emergency call from Rod Kovlin, Sheil's husband, who had called in a panic to report that he had found Sheil in her bathtub, submerged in blood, and that she was dead. He followed the police's instructions to pull her out of the water and attempt to resuscitate her. However, it soon became clear that his efforts to save her life would not be successful. As Sheil's body was cold and motionless, Rod Kovlin covered her with a blanket and waited for the police to arrive. Police quickly arrived and investigated the scene. Upon arrival, they assessed the situation and blocked off a downtown Manhattan street. Initially, officers suspected that Sheil's death may have been a suicide. Inside the apartment, the police found scattered children's toys. Proceeding to the bathroom, they discovered the Sheil wrapped in a blanket by her husband. The bloody water in the tub and the wet floor indicated that Rod Coughlin had recently pulled the body from the water. A bleeding wound on the back of Shiel's head was visible. Police found a torn hinge on the cabinet in the bathroom where Shiel died, suggesting she fell after losing her grip on the doorknob. Experts concluded there was no forced entry after checking around the house. The detective working the case decided to talk to the family members. During the interview, it was discovered that Shiel and Rod Coughlin's 9-year-old daughter was the first to discover her mother's body. Traumatized and shocked by what she saw, she told the police what had happened. It turned out that the night before, she and her younger brother had slept in their mother's bed. Waking up in the middle of the night and realizing that her mother was not there, she went looking for her and stumbled upon the horrifying scene in the bathroom. She quickly called her father, Rod Coughlin, who had recently separated from his mother and was downstairs. He rushed into the bathroom, pulled his wife's body out of the water, and called emergency services. Her account of the events matched Rod Coughlin's, supporting the theory that her death was an accident. The police informed Shiel's family of the tragic event, leaving everyone in shock. An autopsy and forensic examination were scheduled for the following day. When the medical examiner contacted investigators to begin the examination, he was surprised to learn that this procedure would not take place, despite being necessary. This left the examiner confused. It was later discovered that a rabbi from Shiel's synagogue had intervened. The rabbi contacted an organization responsible for burying Orthodox Jews, who then asked the police for permission to enter the scene in accordance with the family's religious rites. The police granted permission and a team of rabbis arrived at the scene. They cleaned up the blood in the bathtub and prepared Shiel's body for burial, in accordance with the family's beliefs. Unfortunately, this process destroyed all evidence and clues before they could be examined by the police forensic department. Orthodox Jewish tradition considers autopsies unacceptable because they involve defiling the body of the deceased. The rabbi quickly stepped in to support Shiel's grieving family, who were grateful for the rabbi's help. As a result, the family agreed to forego an autopsy and organize funeral arrangements. Shiel was buried within 24 hours, with hundreds of people attending to pay their respects. Shiel's parents questioned the cause of Shiel's death. Police told them that potential evidence had been destroyed during the cleanup. They thought that a fall in the bathtub would certainly have caused the accident. But the possibility of death from such an accident seemed unlikely. The family hired a private investigator to investigate the circumstances of her death and determine whether it was indeed an accident. The private investigator begins by going to the family home to talk to Shiel's relatives, and learns that Shiel's marriage to Rod Coughlin is having major problems. Their marriage began to fall apart after their 10th wedding anniversary in 2008. Rod Coughlin frequently changed jobs and developed a gambling addiction, spending a lot of money on gambling. Shiel felt neglected because Rod Coughlin spent a lot of time playing video games. Shiel was also frustrated by the amount of money Rod Coughlin's family spent on his frequent trips, and he was unfaithful to her. Shiel, after discovering his email cheating, she decided to end their marriage and began the process of getting a religious divorce. However, the formal divorce process will take some time to complete. Although they are separated and experiencing strain in their relationship, they has tried to maintain their relationship for the sake of their children. Despite this effort, conflicts and disagreements between Shiel and Rod Coughlin continued to arise. Shiel had recently confided in her loved ones about her grievances with Rod Coughlin, characterizing him as aggressive and hot-tempered. She felt uneasy and monitored. The private detective suspected that Rod Coughlin might have been involved in his wife Shiel's death due to the complexities in their marital life. To investigate further, the detective aimed to determine if a crime had occurred at the scene where Shiel's body was found. He planned to inspect her apartment, but the door was sealed, requiring him to obtain a court order to gain access. Upon arriving at the scene with New York police officers, the detective attempted to unlock the door with a provided key, but it wouldn't budge. Just then, Rod Kovlin appeared from his apartment, claiming he had heard a noise and came to investigate. When questioned by the police and the detective, Rod Kovlin took the key and easily opened the door. This raised suspicions. Had Rod Kovlin genuinely heard a noise, or was he deliberately keeping an eye on the situation? The detective searched the apartment for evidence of murder. Sheil's family said she was home on December 31st, but her phone was missing. A phone charger was found, but not the phone that he paid particular attention to the hinges, which investigators believed she had ripped off during a fall. The more he examined them, the more he suspected that, with Sheil's strength, ripping off hinges that were firmly attached to the cabinet was impossible. The detective discussed his findings with the police, trying to convince them that Sheil's death was not an accident, but a murder. However, the police remained unconvinced, citing a lack of evidence. Therefore, they decided to perform an autopsy to conclusively determine the cause of death. This decision caused a difficult debate with Sheil's family. The exhumation took place 2 weeks after Sheil had been buried. Her loved ones were deeply distressed by the decision. In the Jewish faith, exhumation is considered negative and many religious leaders opposed the practice. The family needed time to think about their next steps. They felt the need to find out the truth about their daughter's death, so they agreed to exhume her body. However, the exhumation process was difficult, so the family had to apply for a special order from the prosecutor's office. Even with the family's consent, they still had to make sure that all the necessary paperwork was completed. Once all the paperwork was completed, they proceeded with the exhumation and autopsy. The autopsy results showed that Sheil did not die from a fall, but from strangulation, which caused her to suffocate and break her neck. The official cause of Sheil's death was revised, and it was no longer considered an accident. Instead, it was officially ruled a murder. The detective's suspicions and efforts were vindicated. The autopsy results were instrumental in prompting the New York Police Department to reopen the investigation into Sheil's death. Detectives began scrutinizing new evidence, including phone records and bank statements. They also interviewed everyone who had interacted with Rod Kovlin and Sheil. The attorneys shared information about Rod Kovlin and Sheil during the first divorce hearing in May 2009. Rod Kovlin claimed that he could not afford the money because he was unemployed, but the judge said that he had to give up gambling and electronics. In court, Rod Kovlin's true nature was exposed, and he continued to criticize Sheil, making false accusations about her lifestyle, finances, and behavior toward their son. He even called Sheil's workplace to defame her. In the subsequent divorce hearing on July 7, 2009, the court banned Rod Kovlin from spending time alone with the children, a ban that remained in place even after Sheil's death. The court also denied Rod Kovlin custody of the children and awarded custody to Rod Kovlin's parents through a social worker. This decision likely angered Rod Kovlin greatly. Police interviewed a former caregiver who had cared for Rod Kovlin's children before he fired her. It was discovered that on December 30th, Sheil had received an expensive keratin hair treatment that cost hundreds of dollars. The care instructions emphasized avoiding humidity in high temperatures for several days, essentially prohibiting baths or showers. Sheil's autopsy revealed no signs of bathing on the day of her death, leading investigators to speculate that she may not have taken a bath. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the building, which showed Rod Kovlin leaving his apartment at 4 a.m. on the day of the murder, dressed to go out. He returned a short time later. The building's security guard found this unusual, as Rod had never left the building that early. The security guard asked Rod Kovlin if he needed anything, but when he said no, Rod Kovlin returned with the chocolate bars and gave them to the security guard. Investigators believe that Rod Kovlin's actions were intentional to create an alibi, and as a result, he became the prime suspect. Sheil and Rod Coughlin were still married, which meant that absent a will or divorce, Rod Coughlin would inherit her estate, which was worth over $5 million. Additionally, on December 31, 2009, Sheil scheduled a meeting with her attorney to update her will and remove Rod Coughlin from the list of beneficiaries, which posed a significant threat to Rod Coughlin's rights and provided a clear motive for the crime. All of Sheil's assets were frozen in a safe deposit account. It is likely that Rod Coughlin knew about Sheil's plans to remove his name from her will, as he may have been monitoring her activities. A review of the surveillance footage revealed that Sheil had returned home at 8 p.m. the night before the crime, talking on her phone. However, the phone had gone missing after the crime. The investigators decided to conduct another search of the crime scene, and upon returning to the apartment, they quickly found Sheil's mobile phone lying on her bedside table, still connected to the charger. When questioned by the police, Rod Coughlin hired a lawyer, Ed, who advised him to remain silent. As a result, investigators had to continue searching for new evidence implicating Rod Coughlin. When they examined Rod Coughlin's phone records, they discovered frequent calls to the number of Deborah Holmes, a married woman with 3 children. 5 months before Sheil's murder, Rod Coughlin and Deborah met at a sick bow tournament and began a passionate affair. They often met at sick bow tournaments or played together online. Investigators saw an opportunity to gather information and decided to contact Deborah with a few questions. However, to their surprise, Deborah responded that her attorney had asked her not to cooperate. Faced with Deborah's refusal to speak, the police asked for the name of her attorney. The response revealed that Deborah and Rod Coughlin were the same attorney. As a last resort, the police searched Sheil's newly discovered phone for incriminating text messages or electronic communications between Rod and Deborah. All data had been completely erased by a professional. Even skilled programmers were unable to recover the deleted messages. Over time, it became clear that he had succeeded in evading justice. While his crimes may have been well executed, the rabbi's meticulous cleaning of the bathroom was a major factor in hampering the investigation. By removing all traces of blood and other evidence, they destroyed DNA, making it increasingly difficult for investigators to collect evidence. The case stalled because Rod Coughlin confessed to the crime, and a lack of evidence prevented the case from going to trial. 5 years have passed since the investigation into Sheil's death began, but no arrests have been made. Police have searched for clues and evidence of Rod Coughlin's involvement in Sheil's death for years, but to no avail. However, the case took a turn when Rod Coughlin's mistress, Deborah, came forward. She contacted the police, and they invited her to the station for questioning. Deborah had recently broken up with Rod Coughlin, which prompted her to contact the police. She shared information with the police that Rod Coughlin had conspired to gain custody of the children, but because he was a suspect in Sheil's death and did not have custody of the children, he could not access the money Sheil left behind. Rod Coughlin hatched a sinister plan to get his hands on Sheil's fortune. Rod Coughlin planned to manipulate his 15-year-old daughter into falsely accusing her grandfather, Rod Coughlin's father, of assaulting her. This would result in the grandfather being imprisoned and losing custody of his granddaughter, and Rod Coughlin would give his daughter a large sum of money upon completion of the mission. Meanwhile, Rod Coughlin had been secretly withdrawing funds from the only account he had access to, which was meant for his children's education. His parents discovered that he was misusing the money and were extremely unhappy with his lack of concern for his children's well-being. This led to a heated dispute between Rod Coughlin and his parents. Rod Coughlin's anger towards his parents escalated to the point where he considered harming them. In 2012, he confided in his lover, Deborah, about his plan to have his daughter poison his parents' tea with rat poison. He believed that since his daughter was a minor, she would receive a lighter sentence if caught. Following this, Rod Coughlin came up with several other schemes. He considered burning down his parents' house and trapping them inside by jamming the doors. Rod Coughlin also thought about arranging a fake marriage for his daughter to a Mexican man, which would have forced her to give up part of her inheritance to him. The police were shocked by the details of Rod Coughlin's plans. Deborah secretly collected evidence, storing a large amount of data on hard drives. Deborah realized she was dealing with a psychopath, and she waited until after she broke up with Rod Coughlin to share the evidence with the police. The recordings she collected of Rod Coughlin's conversations with various people. The police now had to listen carefully to these recordings to find conclusive evidence. Deborah's contribution to the investigation was crucial. As the investigators analyzed the recordings, they made a surprising discovery. In a conversation with a friend he met through backgammon, Rod Coughlin casually mentioned that he had keys to Shields' apartment and could enter it at any time. Investigators found that Rod Coughlin was plotting against his own daughter, planning to pin the responsibility for the Shields' demise on her. Thanks to all the information gathered, the police finally had compelling evidence to charge Rod Coughlin with the demise of his wife. On November 1, 2015, Rod Coughlin was arrested. Shields' family awaited the trial of their daughter's perpetrator, but victory was not assured. Rod Coughlin, while incarcerated, shared intimate details of his wife's murder with a fellow inmate. He even reenacted the strangulation, which matched the autopsy results. During the 7-week trial, the jury heard testimony about the heinous crimes he planned to commit, including murdering his wife, targeting his parents, and framing his own children. The jury was horrified by his cold-blooded nature. In March 2019, the court convicted Rod Coughlin of murdering his wife, Shields. Although there was no direct eyewitness, the overwhelming evidence led to a life imprisonment sentence. With the possibility of parole after 25 years, Rod Coughlin will no longer pose a threat to his family or the people of New York. Hi everyone, thanks for returning. Let's unravel another perplexing mystery, the case of Mitzi Sanchez. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California. She grew up in a large, with 2 brothers and a sister. As a child, Mitzi was cheerful and bright, enjoying time outdoors with friends and playing with her siblings. From a young age, she demonstrated independence, often walking to elementary school with her brother without adult supervision, as the school was nearby. On August 10, 2000, Mitzi's 8th birthday, she was excited about the celebration party her family had planned. However, when she asked her mom if she could skip school, the request was denied. Upset, Mitzi left her home with her brother at around 7:30 a.m. The plan was for her to wait for her brother after classes, and they would walk home together. But when her brother went outside the school, he couldn't find Mitzi. Assuming she had already left without him, he headed home alone. However, when he arrived home, Mitzi had disappeared without a trace. Mitzi's older sister grew concerned when she realized Mitzi was missing, especially since her birthday party was supposed to take place that day. As her absence seemed unusual, the sister called their mother around 4 p.m. to report the situation. The mother immediately contacted Mitzi's school and confirmed that Mitzi had attended all her classes that day. However, when the mother reached out to family members and Mitzi's friends, no one had seen her after school. Mitzi's family became worried and started looking for her. Family, friends, and neighbors mounted a massive search operation. Some walked the streets, while others went door to door along the route from her home to school, asking locals if they had seen her. They also distributed flyers with information about Mitzi. Despite their extensive efforts, they were unable to find her, leading Mitzi's parents to call 911 for assistance. The police quickly joined the search and local media started covering the case. The news of Mitzi's disappearance spread quickly, not just in local news outlets but also across the state. Mitzi's family has given several interviews to raise awareness of her disappearance, Her mother desperately pleaded with them to return her daughter safely. The police received a lot of information, but none of it was useful. 24 hours after Mitzi went missing, the investigation had new clues. A man contacted the police to report finding bloody rags at a landfill. After further examination, experts discovered that the rags were actually bed sheets from a hotel in Vallejo. The evidence was sent to the lab for analysis, but it would take several days to obtain the results. Investigators also went to the hotel, but they were unable to confirm whether Mitzi was there. As the investigators waited for the lab results, they thoroughly searched the landfill for any additional clues, but they found nothing. However, the next day, August 12th, the police received a call that changed the course of the investigation. At around 11 a.m., a man called the police to report a disturbing incident. While driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara, he saw a little girl running towards his van, screaming that someone was chasing her. The girl quickly got into the van, and the driver saw a man running in their direction. A young girl escaped from her kidnapper and sought help from a van driver. As soon as she got into the truck, the kidnapper quickly fled the scene. The girl, who identified herself as Mitzi Sanchez, told the driver what had happened, and he immediately contacted the police. The officers quickly took Mitzi to a hospital for a medical examination. They also arranged for her to speak with her mother over the phone, and soon her relatives arrived at the hospital, where they were reunited with Mitzi. The van driver proved to be a valuable witness in the investigation. He was able to provide the police with the license plate number of the kidnapper's vehicle, which he had seen as it sped away. The truck driver happened to be on the road that day, which was lucky. If he hadn't been there, the kidnapper might have caught up with Mitzi. The police checked the license plate and discovered that the car belonged to 39-year-old Curtis Dean Anderson, a man with a history of crime. He had previous convictions for theft and kidnapping, and was also suspected of other offenses. Police took a statement from Mitzi about what happened to her. Mitzi recounted that on August 10th, she was excited to finish school and head home to celebrate her birthday with her family. When her last class ended, she decided not to wait for her brother and walked home alone. As she walked, she noticed a car parked by the side of the road about a few hundred yards away. Inside, a man was watching her through the rearview mirror. The girl felt uncomfortable, but she was not worried because it was daytime and she was walking on a familiar street. In addition, because she was young, she was not aware of the potential risks posed by strangers. Mitzi was approached by a man who got out of his car and asked for her help. He claimed to have a leg injury from an accident and needed assistance in retrieving a roll of tape from under the car seat. Despite feeling uneasy, Mitzi agreed to help, as her parents had taught her to assist others in need. However, as soon as Mitzi reached for the tape, the man's intentions became clear. He pushed her into the car, covered her mouth, and slammed the door shut. Mitzi tried to scream, but it was too late. The man drove away, Mitzi to watch in horror as they passed by her home, where her family was preparing to celebrate her birthday. The man eventually stopped in a deserted parking lot, where he gave Mitzi new clothes and forced her to change. He then threw away her old clothes in a nearby trash bin. He warned Mitzi not to try to escape, claiming he had a gun and that no one had ever managed to escape from him. For the next few hours, Mitzi was driven to an unknown location. Mitzi demanded to know why she had been kidnapped. But the man's response was that he had gone through a similar experience as a child. When night fell, he stopped the car again and began covering the windows with rags to conceal their location. He then shackled Mitzi's leg with a chain and padlock. The man pulled out a bottle of alcohol and insisted that Mitzi drink some. Despite her initial reluctance, she eventually gave in. He took pictures of her using a camera. The perpetrator then lay down in the car to sleep. Fearing that she would be at his mercy if she fell asleep, Mitzi stayed awake and began thinking of an escape plan. Her chance came when she saw a police car driving past the parking lot. However, it was too far away, and she realized that even if she screamed, the officers would not be able to hear her. The next day, the perpetrator continued to drive Mitzi around the city, forcing her to sit on the floor of the car and covering her with sheets to conceal her from view. At one point, he briefly stepped out of the vehicle, giving Mitzi an opportunity to try and escape. She attempted to free her leg from the chain but quickly realized it was impossible. She also found a nail file and tried to use it to unlock the padlock, but unfortunately, it didn't work. When the perpetrator returned to the car and drove away, he made a disturbing claim. He had stopped by Mitzi's parents' house. Under the guise of a good citizen, he asked for flyers to distribute around town, further manipulating the situation. Mitzi was left feeling shocked and overwhelmed, knowing she had been so close to home yet still remained in captivity. Over the next few hours, the perpetrator repeatedly stopped the car, getting in and out. Eventually, he drove to a remote area outside of town and parked. There, he committed a sexual assault against Mitzi, leaving her in a state of shock. Afterward, the perpetrator fell asleep. The next morning, he resumed driving, making several stops to buy cigarettes and alcohol. When he returned to the car and leaned into the cabin, an object fell out of his pocket. He warned Mitzi not to look, but she disobeyed. She glanced down and saw a large set of keys. Mitzi quickly realized that one of the keys could open the lock on her chain. Although afraid of the perpetrator's possible reaction, Mitzi was brave enough to act. She grabbed the keys, selected one that seemed to fit the lock best, and tried to unlock it. To her relief, the key worked. Mitzi managed to free herself from the chain and moved towards the car door, which was the last barrier between her and freedom. To escape, she opened the window and tried to climb out. However, her body was exhausted, and her legs had almost no strength left. Using the last of my strength, she pushed herself upwards and finally jumped out of the car. As she moved around it, she spotted her kidnapper, who instantly saw her as well. He yelled for her to come back, but Mitzi had no intention of surrendering. She took off in the opposite direction, and her kidnapper started chasing after her. As she fled, she attempted to get help from passing cars by waving her hands and screaming, but all the cars ignored her pleas and kept driving by. Not losing hope, Mitzi kept running forward. In her desperate situation, every moment seemed like an eternity. Mitzi is driven by the fear that if she stops even for a moment, she will be captured by the perpetrator, a fate she is determined to avoid. Finally, she spotted a van and she ran towards it, jumping in front of it to stop the driver. The driver quickly halted, and Mitzi climbed into the cabin, exhausted, dehydrated, and starving, but safe. At the hospital, she received the medical attention she needed, and her family soon arrived to be reunited with her. Mitzi's story quickly became top news in town. When she returned home, thousands of people gathered on her street, cheering and shouting birthday wishes she had missed while in captivity. Meanwhile, the police were searching for her kidnapper, whose location remained unknown. During the investigation, the police showed Mitzi's mother a photo of the suspect, and she recognized him. She had seen him twice before, once before Mitzi's abduction, when he was standing on their street, staring at their house, and again the day after Mitzi's disappearance, when he came to their home asking for flyers. Police eventually arrested the suspect, Curtis. He confessed to Mitzi that she was not his first victim and that no one had ever managed to escape him before. Curtis's careful planning and execution suggested he had experience with similar crimes. It is notable that Curtis had a prior conviction for kidnapping a woman in 1991, for which he served time until his release in November 1999. The trial began in April of the same year. Mitzi bravely testified in a crowded courtroom, recounting every detail of Curtis's crimes against her. Even though Curtis was there, Mitzi remained calm and completed his mission. As a result, Curtis received a 251-year prison sentence. However, this marked the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation. Detectives regularly visited Curtis in jail, questioning him about potential involvement in other crimes. One of these visits, they discovered that Curtis had confessed to a fellow inmate about kidnapping and murdering 8 additional girls. The inmate agreed to cooperate with the police, sharing Curtis's confession in detail. However, Curtis himself was reluctant to reveal all his secrets. Instead of denying the allegations, he attempted to negotiate privileges in exchange for information, speaking with detectives in riddles. As for Mitzi, she was constantly bullied and ridiculed by her classmates, labeling her the kidnapped girl. They even told her she should have died instead of being rescued. The constant bullying made her school years extremely difficult, which hindered her recovery from the traumatic experience. Mitzi could no longer handle the immense pressure. As a result, she turned to alcohol as a means of coping with stress, relying more and more on it. Eventually, she lost hope of returning to a normal life. However, a car accident after a party with friends changes her life forever. Mitzi suffered serious injuries, including a broken neck and arm, and spent 2 weeks in a coma. Upon waking up, she received news from her doctors. She was pregnant with a daughter. This gave Mitzi the power to change her life for the better. She decided to devote herself entirely to her daughter and also to helping other children who were victims of various crimes. Mitzi went on to found a non-profit organization that continues to help those in need to this day. As for Curtis, he passed away in 2007 due to illness, just 6 years after being sentenced. The detectives' only regret was that they were unable to obtain full confessions from him regarding other cases he was suspected of being involved in. Notably, his son followed a similar path and was also convicted of murder. Unfortunately, the son's life was cut short in prison in 2019. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Crystal Perry. Crystal Perry had been born on August 23, 1963, in Rumford, Maine, the youngest of 10 children. Her parents had faced significant difficulties providing for their large family, leading Crystal and her siblings to grow up independent. Crystal and her siblings had always wanted to build their own lives as soon as possible. They eventually moved to different cities and states in search of new opportunities. Crystal had met her future husband Tom in high school. Crystal and Tom married and initially moved to California, but Crystal soon discovered that life in the city was not right for her. After a year and a half, they decided to return to Maine, settling in the small town of Bridgeton, about an hour from Crystal's hometown of Rumford. Crystal found a job at a local shoe store, while Tom worked various odd jobs. Crystal and Tom's lives took a new turn when Crystal became pregnant and they welcomed daughter Sarah. Although Tom was initially excited to become a father, Sarah's arrival complicated Tom's relationship with Crystal. Tom began spending more and more time at a local bar, spending almost all of their limited income on alcohol. One time, he even took the money Crystal had saved to buy alcohol, leaving them with almost nothing. As Tom's drinking habits worsened, the family did not have enough money for basic needs, including food. Finally, Crystal decided to file for divorce. After the divorce, Tom occasionally saw Sarah, but he was largely absent from her life. The situation got worse when Tom got a new girlfriend and she started harassing Crystal. This girlfriend would call Crystal, make threats, come to her house, and cause provocations, all because she was upset with Crystal's past relationship with Tom. Crystal's fears for Sarah's safety grew and she became hesitant to let her daughter visit Tom, worried that Tom's new girlfriend might actually harm Sarah. Crystal moved in with her mother and worked hard to save enough money to buy her own house. After years of saving, she bought a small house near a peaceful lake on the outskirts of Bridgeton. Crystal was excited to provide a stable and loving environment for her daughter, Sarah. Crystal prioritized giving Sarah the attention and love she deserved. In their free time, Crystal and Sarah enjoyed spending quality time together, often watching movies or chatting with each other. One day was like any other day. Crystal went to work, and Sarah went to school. They had their usual dinner together, and Crystal carried Sarah to bed. However, a few hours later, Sarah's peaceful night was broken by a loud scream that startled her. At first, she thought Crystal was arguing on the phone, but it quickly became clear that there was something much more serious going on with Crystal. Crystal had been screaming loudly in the kitchen, causing Sarah to fear that her mother was being attacked. The bedroom door had been slightly open, but the kitchen was out of sight. Stiff with fear, Sarah could not move or make a sound. As she listened, she heard footsteps approaching, making her think that the next attacker would come for her. Feeling scared, she quickly hid behind the bed. However, the footsteps stopped, and Sarah heard the sound of a kitchen drawer opening, followed by the clatter of someone rummaging through utensils. Crystal's screams continued, filled with pleas for mercy, until she was stabbed. With each stab, Crystal's voice grew weaker. Sarah realized she could do nothing and would likely be killed as well. After her mother's screams stopped, she left the room and went into the kitchen, where she witnessed a terrible scene. Her mother lay in a large pool of blood covering the floor. Confused, Sarah asked her neighbors for help and eventually found an Italian restaurant whose owner lived in an adjacent building. They opened the door for Sarah and called 911 to report the incident. The officers immediately went to their home. Upon arrival, officers witnessed a gruesome scene. The kitchen was covered in blood, including the floors, walls, and kitchen appliances. Crystal had died, and medical experts determined that Crystal had lost too much blood. Police found a handprint on the front door glass, possibly Sarah's. No other fingerprints were found, but there were many bloody shoe prints on the kitchen floor. Investigators took photos to determine the shoe size and model, assuming they belonged to the killer. A trail of blood led to Sarah's bedroom but suddenly stopped as if the killer had changed his mind. One particular detail caught the detective's attention. The killer had tried to wipe away some blood on the floor. With the blood stains spreading, this effort seemed futile. Further investigation revealed that some of the drops of blood on the floor were irregularly shaped, suggesting they had fallen from the knife. This led investigators to believe that drops of blood might have flown out of the knife during the attack. Investigations showed that, in addition to the initial drops of blood, other drops of blood on the floor appeared to have fallen at a 90-degree angle, suggesting they originated from a higher point. Detectives suspected these drops might belong to the perpetrator, who might have been injured during the crime. Further supporting this theory, the trail of blood drops led directly to a roll of tissue. This showed that the perpetrator used a tissue to stop the bleeding before hastily leaving the scene. Autopsy results showed that Crystal's body had suffered more than 50 stab wounds. The murder weapon, possibly a kitchen knife, was not found at the crime scene, suggesting the perpetrator might have brought it with him. An important detail revealed that the force used was so great that part of the knife broke and was stuck in Crystal's body. The investigation also found evidence of a previous sexual assault. As a result, medical experts were able to collect and analyze the perpetrator's semen along with the blood samples obtained, sending both for further laboratory testing. However, there was a problem. The local DNA laboratory was severely understaffed due to funding problems, leading to a significant backlog. As a result, detectives had to begin the investigation without forensic evidence, which would take at least 6 months to process. The investigation began by ruling out robbery as a motive because nothing was missing from the house. Furthermore, there were no signs of forced entry, so the police suspected that the victim had arbitrarily opened the door to let the perpetrator in. Since she was wearing pajamas, it was unlikely that she was expecting visitors. Detectives came up with two theories. Either the victim knew her killer, or someone she didn't know knocked on her door and convinced her to let them in under false pretenses. To pursue this lead, detectives turned their attention to the only witness, Sarah, who was undergoing a medical examination at the hospital. The police began questioning Sarah about the killer, and she explained that she had stayed in the bedroom until the incident was over. However, the police were a bit skeptical about her story. They asked her how she knew her mother had been attacked with a knife, and Sarah replied that it was obvious. Despite her reaction, detectives continued to pressure her, suspecting that she might have been withholding information and might have seen the perpetrator. During the first 3 days after the murder, police questioned Sarah 18 times in the hope that her story would change. However, she always maintained that everything happened as she initially described. Meanwhile, detectives pursued other leads and achieved their first breakthrough. They discovered a pair of boots at a local shoe store whose sole pattern resembled bloody footprints found at the crime scene. Additionally, they learned that Crystal had been harassed by Teresa, Crystal's ex-husband's girlfriend. Despite evidence that the killer was a man, the police decided to investigate Teresa, considering her history of threatening to kill Crystal. Maybe Teresa had found an accomplice to commit the crime. However, detectives found no evidence to support this theory. Further investigation revealed that Crystal was in a relationship with a man named Dennis at the time of her death. The two had met 2 years ago when Dennis started working at the shoe store. Dennis and Crystal began dating, and Dennis eventually proposed to her. Although Crystal accepted, they never married. Their relationship was tense, with frequent arguments and Dennis engaging in aggressive behavior, such as breaking objects and banging on walls. However, there was no evidence that he ever physically harmed Crystal. The day after Crystal's murder, detectives visited Dennis at his home. When they asked if he had left the house the night before or if he had seen Crystal, Dennis immediately asked if she was dead and then fainted. After regaining consciousness, he answered the detectives' questions. Dennis explained that he had planned to visit Crystal that evening but was delayed because he was helping a friend fix his car. When he later called Crystal, she said it was too late, leading to an argument and Dennis staying home. Police were able to verify Dennis' alibi, confirming that he had helped his friend that evening. Dennis also agreed to take a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception, except when asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death. He replied no, but the test detected his tremors. Additionally, detectives discovered that Dennis had the same shoe size as the killer, but no matching shoes were found in his house. Dennis agreed to provide a DNA sample but made a special request. Dennis had made a special request to the detectives. If they decided to arrest him, he had asked them to enter his workplace through the back door, instead of the main entrance. He had explained that he did not want to disrupt the work environment or make noise in front of his colleagues because his boss had always treated him kindly. However, because he had continued to claim innocence, this request had raised suspicions. The police investigation had led to another important discovery. They had contacted Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town, and she had revealed that Crystal had confided in her just weeks before the murder. Crystal had expressed her fear towards Dennis, saying their arguments had escalated and had become more and more heated. Dennis' behavior had also become more and more aggressive, causing Crystal to consider ending their relationship. However, she had hesitated to do so because she was afraid of his reaction. Detectives had also interviewed one of Crystal's co-workers, but she had not provided any useful information during their conversation. However, as soon as the police had left, Dennis had gone to the person's workplace and had begun asking about her conversation with the detectives. The police investigation had continued despite the lack of evidence against the initial suspect, as DNA test results would have taken several months to process. Meanwhile, they had pursued other leads. A strange tip had led them to a local man named Donnie, who had allegedly bragged about killing Crystal while drunk at a party. However, when questioned, Donnie had claimed to have no memory of the party and had denied any involvement in the murder. The police investigation into Crystal's murder had had difficulty finding any concrete clues. In an effort to uncover new information, Crystal's family had offered a $10,000 reward and had distributed flyers around town. However, Teresa, Crystal's ex-husband's girlfriend, had been seen repeatedly tearing up these flyers, raising suspicions. The ex-husband, Tom, had been thoroughly investigated but had eventually been ruled out as a suspect due to his severe alcoholism. His heavy daily drinking had made it unlikely he would commit a crime, and he had had no clear motive. Police had also investigated 2 other men Crystal had dated after her divorce but had found no evidence linking them to the crime. All 3 men, including Tom, had provided DNA samples to be sent to a laboratory for analysis. 9 months after the murder, the lab results had finally come in, but they hadn't matched any of the suspects, including Dennis. This had left detectives with no new leads. They had asked to take Dennis's DNA sample again for further testing, but the results had still been the same. The investigation into Crystal's murder had hit a dead end, causing detectives to reinvestigate their only witness, Sarah. They had suspected that Sarah might be hiding information or that a traumatic experience had caused her to repress memories of the killer. To question her further, police had gone to Texas, where Sarah was living with her aunt. A polygraph test had been administered to Sarah, but the results hadn't shown any deception. Despite this, investigators had continued to question her for days, asking the same questions over and over again. However, Sarah had always maintained that she had not seen the killer. The case had remained unsolved for several years. Police had continued to interview potential suspects and follow up on leads. But to no avail. The breakthrough had come in the late 1990s with the introduction of the FBI's DNA database. Investigators had uploaded the killer's DNA sample, but unfortunately, no matches had been found. The detective asked Sarah to work with a psychologist to try to recall any repressed memories of the crime. Even though Sarah agreed, the psychologist ultimately concluded that she really didn't remember anything and was telling the truth about not seeing the killer. The case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives continued to investigate but found no new leads. This changed in 2006 when a surprising development occurred. A DNA sample was entered into the FBI database and it matched blood and semen left at the crime scene where Crystal was killed. The DNA belonged to a man named Michael Hutchinson, who was never suspected in the case. Detectives discovered that in 2003, Hutchinson was arrested for assault and threatening with a weapon, resulting in a sentence of 6 months in prison and 3 years of probation. During his arrest, a DNA sample was collected, but it was not uploaded to the FBI database at the time. It was instead stored in a laboratory. 3 years after the initial DNA sample was taken, Michael was arrested for drunk driving with his children. He was released on bail but failed to appear in court, leading to jail time. Ironically, Michael was arrested on the day of the wedding and put in a prison cell. His DNA sample was retrieved and quickly uploaded to the database. The detective contacted Sarah, informing her of the development, but asked her to keep the information confidential until formal charges were filed. When asked if she knew the suspect, Sarah replied that she did not. Given that Michael was already in custody, the detective carefully built the case to prevent any possibility of him evading punishment. Further investigation revealed that at the time of the murder, Michael lived in Bridgeton, just 2 miles from Crystal's residence. When he was 19, Michael lived near the Italian restaurant where Sarah called the police. He regularly drove to his mother's house, which was just a short distance from Crystal's, meaning he often passed by her residence. The detective discovered that Michael could have easily encountered Crystal multiple times before the murder. When questioned in prison, Michael insisted he was not involved in Crystal's murder and denied knowing her, despite the presence of his semen and blood on her body at the crime scene. The detective found his denial unconvincing. During the visit to the prison, the detective observed a noticeable scar on Michael's palm. This was very significant because it was likely that Crystal's killer injured his hand during the crime. While this alone would not have been enough evidence in court, combined with DNA evidence, it contributed to Michael's eventual murder charge. According to the prosecution, Michael, an illegal drug user, saw Crystal as he passed her house on the night of the murder. He decided to assault her, leading to her death. While Michael refused to confess, the available evidence clearly showed that he was responsible for the assault and murder of Crystal. During the trial, an explanation was found for the murderer's lack of fingerprints at the crime scene. It turned out that Michael's job as a bricklayer was the reason. Over time, the constant wear and tear on his hands had erased the patterns on his palms, making it impossible for him to leave fingerprints. Michael presented testimony about his timeline to defend himself. He claimed he had met Crystal at a bar and they had returned to her place to have consensual sex. However, his story became suspicious when he described a strange man wearing a black motorcycle jacket breaking into the house, knocking him unconscious, and killing Crystal. When Michael regained consciousness, he allegedly tried to fight off the attacker but had injured his hand. The attacker then fled, and Michael also left the crime scene without a reasonable explanation. Michael's story was very unconvincing. The investigation revealed that the only shoe prints at the scene had belonged to Michael. If his story was true, the intruder would have had to take off his shoes before entering the house, which still wouldn't have explained the lack of other marks on the floor. Furthermore, no witnesses had come forward to confirm that Crystal had been at the bar with Michael. The trial ended on April 9, 2007, with Michael being unanimously found guilty. As a result, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and remained incarcerated. Sarah's life was deeply affected by her mother's death, but she found the strength to move forward with time. She pursued further education, became a writer, and wrote a book about her mother's murder. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case, the case of Rowan Ford. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella in Missouri. Later, her mom met a man named David, and they got married. Colleen had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their wedding, she and David had a daughter together. Altogether, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and they shared a very close bond. She spent a lot of time outdoors, riding her bike around town, enjoying swimming, and indulging in her passion for drawing. She also liked going to Sunday school at the local church, where she always volunteered to help other kids who had some issues with their tasks. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old, she was in the 4th grade at the local elementary school. Her mom worked the night shift at a store, while her stepdad spent most of the day on the farm, which made Rowan often fend for herself, making her very independent. On November 2nd, she stayed home alone as usual. Her mom went to work, and her stepdad hadn't returned from the farm yet. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Colleen came home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but her daughter wasn't there. She asked her husband where her daughter was, and he said she had asked him if she could have a sleepover at a friend's house, and he had let her go. He didn't even ask the friend's name because their town was very small, and he wasn't worried about anything happening to her. But Colleen started to worry and decided to check with all of Rowan's friends. Since there were only a few streets in their town, it didn't take long, but none of them had seen her, and she hadn't stayed over at any of their houses, which made her mother even more concerned. Colleen searched the whole town but couldn't find her daughter. She went back home and told her husband that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She asked him to call the police and report her missing, but he reassured her that everything was fine and that she would come home soon. After waiting for several more hours with no sign of Rowan, Colleen took matters into her own hands and dialed 911 herself. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to their house to speak with David, and as he was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared, David said that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with his colleague Christopher, their mutual friend Nathan came by. They all decided to go to David's place to have some drinks and play pool. They stopped by the store, bought some alcohol, and went to David's house, where they spent several hours. Later in the night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town, where his trailer was. They persuaded David to join them to continue the fun. Before leaving the house, he checked on Rowan in her room, seeing that she was asleep. David left with his friends, and they stopped by the store again to grab more alcohol and headed to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. After that, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to give him a ride. Nathan agreed but chose to take back roads instead of the main highway. By that time Nathan was quite drunk and didn't want to risk encountering the police. Nathan dropped David off and drove home. David went straight to bed. Soon after, he was awakened by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and fell back asleep. Police approached this story with some skepticism. What puzzled them most was the fact that a 9-year-old girl decided to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and her stepfather let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The sheriff considered that David might be hiding something or directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Police searched the town and its surroundings until late at night. Local residents immediately joined the search, as they all knew Rowan's family and wanted to help. The population of Stella was only about 150 people, so news of her disappearance spread throughout the county. People were used to being able to let their children play outside without a worry, as nothing ever happened in such a quiet place. But now that Rowan vanished without a trace, and the police were unable to find her for a whole day, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The search for Rowan yielded no results on the first day. However, the investigation progressed on November 4th when the police spoke with Christopher in a neighboring town. He corroborated David's account, but revealed that David had not contacted him to inform him of Rowan's disappearance. Christopher stated he had not spoken with Rowan or her friends since that evening. Despite an expanded search with more volunteers, the police failed to find Rowan or any clues about her disappearance. The following day, the FBI joined the investigation while the local police continued searching the town and surrounding areas. As a result of growing skepticism towards David's account, detectives started focusing on a potential abduction. They spoke with all of Rowan's friends and verified that none of them had seen her on the night she went missing. As investigators questioned David, his account raised even more suspicions. David's details were inconsistent and contradictory. He altered the timeline of his whereabouts that night on multiple occasions. Additionally, David speculates that it is possible that Rowan left without his permission, which makes his story even more suspicious. During their investigation, FBI agents found out that David had borrowed his mother's car on the night of Rowan's disappearance, a detail he initially left out when questioned by the police. This new information led the authorities to seize both his mother's car and his own pickup truck for forensic examination. But unfortunately, no evidence was discovered. As part of the investigation, detectives wanted to speak with Christopher and Nathan again, since both had been with David that evening. Christopher was invited to the police station for further questioning, where he recounted the same story as before. He also agreed to take a polygraph test, which showed no signs of dishonesty. After leaving the police station and returning to work, Christopher noticed Sheriff Clark's car and signaled for him to stop. As the sheriff of Whitton, where Christopher lived, Clark had known him since childhood. Sheriff Clark was close friends with Christopher's foster parents and was someone Christopher had always looked up to and sought advice from in times of need. Sheriff Clark met with Christopher to discuss Rowan's disappearance. Although familiar with the case, Clark hadn't been directly involved since the investigation was led by the Stella Department. During their conversation, Clark noticed that Christopher was acting strangely, which led him to suspect that Christopher might be hiding something. Given the gravity of the situation and Rowan's uncertain fate, Clark shared his concerns with the FBI. His call prompted investigators to consider the possibility that Christopher might be withholding crucial information that could link Rowan's stepfather to her disappearance. They wondered if Christopher's actions were directed by Rowan's stepfather to lie, and whether Christopher feared being seen as an accomplice if he told the truth. Sheriff Clark told the FBI agents that he had a close relationship with Christopher and offered to help persuade him to cooperate. That evening, Christopher visited Colleen's house to ask about the search progress. FBI agents also arrived to speak with Colleen again and saw Christopher there. They asked him questions, and he repeated his previous account. However, Christopher then mentioned for the first time that he didn't rule out David's possible involvement in Rowan's disappearance. He expressed his willingness to help uncover the truth, even if it was terrible, and suggested wearing a wire to talk to David and try to get him to confess. The detectives decided against this approach. Instead, they asked Christopher to suggest locations where David might have hidden Rowan's body. Christopher provided several locations, which the police searched the next morning. Meanwhile, FBI agents questioned David again, but he continued to deny any involvement. Detectives searched Christopher's home for leads, but the search yielded no results. Meanwhile, Christopher visited the sheriff's office to discuss his encounter with the FBI with Clark. During their conversation, the sheriff sensed that Christopher was holding back information. After their meeting, Clark reached out to the detectives again, suggesting that Christopher might be withholding crucial information that helped prove David's involvement in the case. The FBI agents asked the sheriff to persuade Christopher to open up, as he had been in regular contact with Clark to discuss the case. It seemed that Christopher wanted to share important details but was hesitant to do so for unknown reasons. The following day, November 7th, the police asked Christopher to return to the station. They requested his permission to search a safe located in David's house, where Christopher had been living temporarily and still had some belongings. Christopher agreed to the search and also allowed the police to search his trailer and car. Additionally, Christopher voluntarily provided a DNA sample and agreed to answer the detectives' questions again. During the questioning, he was asked to confirm David's story, but this time, Christopher revealed that his friend's account was not entirely accurate. The investigators then pressed him to disclose what really happened that evening. Christopher became agitated when the police treated him like a suspect in Rowan's disappearance. He refused to continue the conversation and left the station after warning the detectives that he might hire a lawyer. Later that evening, Christopher met with Sheriff Clark to express his concerns about the detectives' behavior. Clark acknowledged Christopher's right to remain silent but explained that the police were doing everything possible to find Rowan. Christopher stated that he would no longer cooperate with the detectives and would only speak with Clark if he had any further information to share. Clark continued to encourage Christopher to open up, and eventually, Christopher broke down in tears, claiming that he loved Rowan and would never harm her. During his time living with the David family, Christopher formed a close bond with Rowan and the other children. They grew to treat him like one of their own, even affectionately referring to him as Uncle Christopher. Sheriff Clark realized that Christopher was on the verge of revealing crucial information, but just as he was about to open up, a visitor arrived at the police station, briefly distracting Clark and causing Christopher to leave. Sheriff Clark reached out to the FBI, updating them on his conversation with Christopher. Clark explained that Christopher was almost ready to disclose what he knew, but warned that pressuring him too hard could lead to him becoming defensive and seeking the help of a lawyer. Clark recommended giving Christopher time to reflect, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the following day but yielded no results. However, a new clue came on November 9th, exactly 1 week after her disappearance. Search teams converged on a remote area near the town of Powell, about 10 miles from Stella, and made a significant discovery in the fields and woods, a large pit in the ground. When authorities searched the area, they found Rowan's body hidden under leaves and debris. She was not wearing any clothing from the waist down except for a pair of stockings. A medical examination revealed signs of strangulation and evidence of a sexual assault. After the discovery, FBI agents reached out to Sheriff Clark, asking him to speak with Christopher again, hoping Christopher would now be more forthcoming. Sheriff Clark learned that earlier that morning, Christopher had visited the station, looking for him, and told other officers that he needed to speak with Clark urgently. Sheriff Clark then began searching for Christopher, checking all his usual locations, but he was nowhere to be found. This continued until Christopher contacted Sheriff Clark himself, sounding distressed and asking if he was being followed. Christopher explained that after hearing about Rowan's body, he had driven around town to clear his head and noticed a gray car following him. Sheriff Clark assures Christopher that he knows nothing about the surveillance and suggests they meet in person. When they met, Christopher appeared nervous and expressed concerns for his safety. He feared that with Rowan's body found, he might be accused of murder and that someone might seek revenge against him. Clark took Christopher to the police station, and he said that now when the case had been classified as a homicide, it was time for Christopher to reveal everything he knew. However, when Clark asked Christopher to share what David had done to Rowan, Christopher became emotional and hesitant to talk at the station. He explained that there were too many people around and suggested they move to a quieter location. Clark agreed, and they drove to a small bridge a few miles outside of town. Once they arrived, Christopher asked Clark to handcuff him. Clark was surprised but tried to reassure Christopher that it wasn't necessary. Christopher insists that what he is about to say will change everything and that Clark will then have to arrest him. Christopher then began recounting the events of that night. He told Clark that he, Nathan, and David had gone to his trailer to continue drinking. Later, his friends decided it was time to head home. Nathan gave David a ride, and they chose to take back roads to avoid the police. Christopher had shocked Clark that he had intended to sexually assault Rowan. To carry out his plan, Christopher took advantage of the time when his friends were busy taking a detour through the field. He drove straight to David's house via the main highway. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped into Rowan's room, picked her up, and quietly transported her to his vehicle, carefully avoiding detection as she slept. When they reached his trailer, he sexually assaulted Rowan. This was interrupted when Rowan regained consciousness and tried her best to free herself, but to no avail. During the crime, Christopher took precautions to avoid recognition, deliberately choosing to keep the lights off and maintain his silence. He originally planned to return Rowan to her home under the guise of innocence, but under the illumination of a bright moon, Rowan finally laid eyes on Christopher as he transported her from the trailer. He grabbed a rope, resorted to force to resolve his predicament, and took Rowan's life with his bare hands. He frantically thought of ways to cover up his crime. He got in his car and began driving around the county, pondering methods of disposing of the body. He then remembered a large pit near a neighboring town and headed in that direction. When he arrived, he dumped Rowan's body in the hole and attempted to cover it with tree branches. Returning to the trailer, Christopher discovered traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. He also realized he needed to dispose of her pants, underwear, and the rope used to kill her. He gathered these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, he quickly reconsidered, realizing that a large fire would likely attract unwanted attention. Instead, Christopher dragged the barrel into a shed, closed the door, and started the fire inside. This revelation shocked Clark, who had previously suspected David of committing the crime and believed Christopher was withholding information. It was difficult for Clark to accept that a man he had known for nearly 20 years, a man with 3 young children of his own, was capable of such brutality. Although Christopher appears to be a good-natured man, his true nature is much more worrying. After finishing his story, Christopher willingly went to the police station with Clark. Once there, Christopher repeated his confession to the FBI agents and was subsequently arrested for murder. He also gave the authorities permission to search his trailer and car. As he concluded his confession, Christopher expressed regret over his actions and stated that he had cried uncontrollably the following day. The detectives then informed David about Christopher's confession. Given David's suspicious behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected he might be covering for his friend. However, during interrogation, David revealed a shocking new testimony. David claimed that when he found Rowan missing from her room, he suspected Christopher might have taken her. He took his mother's car and drove to Christopher's trailer. He found Rowan lying on the bed. Christopher leaned towards her. Instead of rescuing Rowan, David joined in and also sexually assaulted her. He then helped Christopher kill her and dispose of her body. David reported that during that traumatic incident, his brain went into shock, and he had no memory of the night for several days. The detectives, surprised by this new information, re-questioned Christopher to verify David's claim. However, Christopher maintained that David was not involved and that incident unfolded as he had initially described. The inconsistencies puzzled the detectives, but Christopher's account still matched incident that had occurred. Medical examination revealed that the victim was strangled with a thin rope, a detail that only the killer would be aware of. A search of the trailer led to the discovery of a barrel containing ashes, and hair similar to Rowan's was found in Christopher's car. Although investigators were still uncertain about the truthfulness of each man's account, both David and Christopher made incriminating statements. As a result, David was also arrested, and the case were sent to court for further proceedings. During the trial, Christopher requested that his statements be excluded from the case, arguing that he was not aware they could be used against him and that the police had violated his rights. However, the judge rejected this request, as all of Christopher's conversations with investigators were voluntary. Christopher also attempted to present mitigating circumstances, citing his difficult childhood as a factor. He had been shuffled between biological and foster parents from a young age, which had a significant impact on him. Despite these efforts, Christopher was unable to avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, Christopher was sentenced to death. He appealed the sentence, but was unsuccessful. In contrast, David's situation was more complex. Although he admitted to assaulting and killing Rowan, his account conflicted with Christopher's statements, creating a significant problem. If the prosecution had charged David with murder, it could have potentially led to Christopher's conviction being overturned, allowing David to avoid accountability as well. However, due to the lack of concrete evidence, such as DNA, in fact, they were still uncertain about David's involvement. Although it was possible that David might have collaborated with Christopher in committing the crime, there was no supporting evidence for this theory. To minimize the risk of overturning Christopher's sentence, the prosecution made the difficult decision to reduce David's charges. As a result, David pleaded guilty to 2 lesser charges: child endangerment and obstruction of justice. David received an 11 years prison sentence, with a minimum of 5 years to be served. This outcome sparked widespread outrage, as many felt that if David was indeed involved in the murder, his punishment was disproportionately lenient. Unfortunately, this sentence is now final, and it is unlikely that David will face retrial for this case. Christopher remains in prison awaiting execution, but it's uncertain whether the death penalty will be carried out due to the often lengthy time between sentencing and execution, which can span decades, meaning he might spend the rest of his life in prison instead.